Section 33 of the Medici, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Medici, Volume 1, by G. F. Young. Chapter 13. Giovanni, Leo X. Born 1476. Pope 1513 to 1521. Died 1521. Leo X was by no means so important a character as it has been universally the fashion to depict him. The splendor which surrounded him has caught the popular imagination, and has prevented its being seen how little he merited the exalted view of him which has obtained general acceptance. When, however, he is brought to stand side by side with the other members of his family, this inevitably comes out. The combined effect of his desire to take life easily and his unfailing common sense, which kept him from involving himself in matters likely to lead to embarrassment and disaster, prevented him from becoming, as did his cousin Clement VII, the pivot round which the great events which took place in his time revolved. As a result, in a history of the Medici family, where each individual occupies the place demanded by his own character and deeds, the narrative of Leo's life becomes of far less importance than that of his much less pleasing cousin Clement, who not only played a more important part in the affairs of Europe, but also pursued a course which had infinitely greater effect on the subsequent fortunes of the family. Giovanni, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, was only 37 when, on the 11th March, 1513, he was elected pope. During the previous 20 years, from the time when at 16 he had left his home in Florence to take his seat for the first time in the Sacred College, his life had been a checkered one. Returning to Florence after only a few months in Rome, he had, during the 2 years that followed, seen the rapidly increasing unpopularity of his family under his brother Pietro's unsympathetic rule, had been driven forth with him into exile, had spent 5 years in endeavors at various courts to obtain assistance for his brother in military enterprises against Florence, which invariably failed, and then, departing from Italy for a time, had wandered through northern Europe, seeing many cities and the life of many lands. Returning at length to Rome, he had gradually won for himself and his family a position of favor with the Pope, and had been sent by him on important missions, had been placed practically in command of a military force, had taken part in a severely fought battle and been taken prisoner, had seen the terrible sack of Prato and done something to mitigate its horrors, and finally had re-entered his native city in triumph, and re-established his family in power there. All this had given him a wide experience of men and affairs, but it had not altered his ease-loving disposition. Leo X gave his name to his age, and his 9 years' reign as Pope has been extolled to the skies by the literary men of 3 centuries. His character has in part been already noted. Apart from his love of literature and art, an unusually strong common sense and a genial good nature were his chief characteristics. Erasmus, who knew him well, praises his kindness and humanity, his magnanimity and learning, the charm of his manner, and his love of peace and the fine arts, and comparing his pontificate with that which had preceded it, says that an age of iron was suddenly transformed into one of gold. And even Sarpi states, Leo, noble by birth and culture, brought many aptitudes to the papacy, especially a remarkable knowledge of classical literature, humanity, kindness, the greatest liberality, and an avowed intention of supporting artists and learned men, who for many years had enjoyed no such favor in the Holy See. While Dr. Krauss says, paramount in Leo's character were his gentleness and cheerfulness, his indulgence both for himself and others, his love of peace and hatred of war. But on his personal character the great blot must rest that he passed his life in intellectual self-indulgence, and took his pleasure in hunting and amusement while the Teutonic North was bursting the bounds of reverence and authority which bound Europe to Rome. On becoming pope, Leo at once actively began all that encouragement of literature and art for which his pontificate is famous, inviting learned men from all parts of Italy to Rome, making plans for founding a great university there for the study of the Greek and Latin authors, corresponding with Aldus Manutius and others about inaugurating a printing press at Rome, commencing research work to obtain lost manuscripts of the classical age, planning schemes for important works to be executed by Raphael and other artists, and setting himself in every way to advance the cause of learning and art. He also set about assuring the future of his family. He created as cardinals his two first cousins, Giulio de Medici and Luigi Rossi, also his nephews, each a son of one of his three married sisters, Innocenzio Cibo, Giovanni Salviati, and Niccolò Ridolfi. With 5 cardinals in the family, there would be a good probability that one of them would succeed him as pope. His schemes for securing to the family the Duchy of Urbino have already been noted. In January 1515, Francis I, on succeeding to the French throne, began to make preparations for an expedition to recover Milan. Leo X endeavored to oppose this by means of an alliance between himself, Ferdinand of Spain, and the Emperor Maximilian. But Francis gained the victory of Marignano and took Milan, and Leo was forced to come to terms with him, which were settled at a personal conference between them, held at Bologna in December 1515. On his way to this conference, Leo stayed 3 days in Florence, where a splendid reception was prepared for him. Landucci, who was present, states that the grandeur of this reception was beyond description, and that no other city in the world would or could have done the like. The city was decorated in all directions with triumphal arches, imitations of buildings of the classic age, statues, and allegorical devices. In the Piazza della Signoria, an octagonal temple was erected by San Gallo. Over the unfinished facade of the Duomo, the design for it, made by Lorenzo the Magnificent himself, was executed in wood by Sansovino and painted by Andrea del Sarto. A colossal Hercules for the Loggia de Lanzi was sculptured by Baccio Bandinelli. Various triumphal arches were erected by Montelusso, Rosso, and Granacci, one between the Badia and the Bargello, and another near the monastery of San Marco, being specially fine. And the city gave itself up to welcoming with numerous festivities the first Florentine who had ever sat on the papal throne. On his return from Bologna, Leo stayed at Florence for more than a month, remaining there till the 17th February 1516, and during this visit he made arrangements for completing the family church of San Lorenzo. He ordered Michelangelo to prepare a design for the façade, and sent him to Carrara to obtain the necessary marble. And for this purpose, no less than 34 shiploads of marble were subsequently dispatched to Florence, though the façade remains to this day untouched. Leo also directed the construction by Michelangelo of the new sacristy in San Lorenzo, which the Pope intended should form a mausoleum to contain 6 tombs, those of his father, Lorenzo, and his uncle, Giuliano, as well as tombs for the other 4 members of the family who were then living, viz., himself, his brother Giuliano, his cousin Giulio, and his nephew Lorenzo. But only 2 of these 6 tombs were ever completed. In 1516, Leo X, immediately upon his brother Giuliano's death, seized Urbino, as previously mentioned, in order to form a sovereignty for his nephew Lorenzo. The dissatisfaction caused by this procedure led, in the spring of 1517, to a remarkable episode. A serious conspiracy, headed by the young Cardinal of Siena, Alfonso Petrucci, was formed amongst the cardinals to poison the Pope. This being discovered, Petrucci, who had absented himself from Rome, was invited thither under a safe conduct, as well as a solemn promise given by Leo to the Spanish ambassador that Petrucci's life would be spared, both of which promises were disregarded as soon as the latter reached Rome, where he was thrown into prison and condemned to death. Further examination proved that a large number of cardinals were implicated in the plot, and Petrucci with his 2 chief assistants, a surgeon and a secretary, were cruelly tortured and put to death. The lives of the other cardinals concerned were spared, but they were subjected to various deprivations. These punishments aroused so great disaffection among nearly all the remaining cardinals that the Pope had to be surrounded by guards even when celebrating Mass in St. Peter's. To meet this alarming state of affairs and finally put an end to this extraordinary episode, Leo X took the bold and unprecedented step of creating in one day 31 new cardinals. At this period, just before the Reformation, the plurality of offices held by the higher clergy was scandalous. Roscoe states, "It is actually and substantially true that the same person was frequently at the same time an archbishop in Germany, a bishop in France or England, an abbot or a prior in Poland or Spain, and a cardinal in Rome." The creation of so many additional cardinals, with the benefices given to them, of course increased this evil, and this large number of important church offices held by permanent absentees, tending as it did to much corruption and maladministration in the diocese, thus deprived of their proper rulers, helped to increase the dissatisfaction with the Church which was steadily growing in northern Europe. In 1518, Leo X arranged with Francis I the marriage already mentioned between his nephew Lorenzo and the king's relative, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, this being the second matrimonial alliance with the royal family of France made by the Medici family. When in the following year Lorenzo died, Leo sent his cousin Giulio to administer Florentine affairs for a time. The latter remained in Florence from May to October 1519. And on his return to Rome, Cardinal Passarini was left in charge of the Medician interests in Florence on behalf of the Pope, and continued in charge for the next 2 years. In 1521, Perugia being greatly misgoverned by its ruler, Gianpaolo Baglioni, described as a monster of iniquity, Leo X determined to put an end to the Baglioni rule there, and to incorporate Perugia with the states of the Church. He seems to have considered that against such a criminal any treachery was admissible. Baglioni was invited to Rome under the pretext of consulting with him about political affairs, and given the Pope's safe conduct, but on arrival was thrown into prison, subjected to torture, and beheaded in the castle of Sant'Angelo, the Pope taking possession of Perugia. About the same time, a similarly treacherous endeavor was made to enlarge still further the states of the Church by seizing Ferrara, but the agents who had been bribed to open the gates on the approach of the papal forces revealed the plot to the Duke of Ferrara, and the attempt failed. Even Roscoe, with all his admiration for Leo X, remarks that these operations disclose some of the darkest shades of his character. And they are to be attributed, if not wholly, at all events to a very large extent, to that action which was the fundamental mistake of Leo X's life. For in order to satisfy his easygoing temperament, and indulge in those pursuits of literature and art, convivial pleasures, and luxurious enjoyment, for which alone he cared, Leo surrendered the whole conduct of the political affairs of the papacy into the hands of his energetic and crafty cousin Giulio, with the consequences which were to be expected from the latter's unscrupulous character. Leo X must, of course, bear the full responsibility for the acts which he permitted to be done in his name, but while this is so, the political acts of his pontificate are to be ascribed rather to Giulio than to Giovanni, and in looking at the latter's life and character, this requires to be borne in mind. To him, political and ecclesiastical affairs were a wearisome burden to be got rid of as much as possible, while as time went on, he left them more and more in the hands that were so willing to undertake them, leaving him free to attend to those matters which to him were so much more congenial. It was indeed hard on such a nature that it should be his lot to have to deal with a movement like the Reformation, and be expected to divert his attention from the latest reproduction of some classical work brought out by Aldo's printing press to give heed to the troublesome complaints of a Luther. It is almost as much a relief to us as it must have been to Leo himself to turn from his political life to his action in regard to those matters which were his chief interest. Here we find another man altogether, and here there is neither apathy, boredom, surrender of his leadership to others, nor treacherous or underhand dealing. In that world of literature and art which his soul loved, and in his sympathy for all the culture of his time, he is worthy of that atmosphere of splendor which is gathered round his name. His great-grandfather Cosimo and his father Lorenzo had contrived both to conduct difficult political affairs and also to achieve mighty results in the domain of literature and art. Leo X had none of the energy of his ancestors, while his abilities were cast in a smaller mold, so that he found one half of the matter as much as he could attend to. But in that half his achievements, though not to be compared to those of his father and great-grandfather, were considerable. Moreover, he had greater resources to draw upon. Art had advanced to its zenith. Great stores of the classical literature had by this time been brought to light. Printing had come to assist in their reproduction, instead of the slow and laborious process of hand-copying. While great as had been the wealth which his ancestors had possessed to assist their efforts in this cause, Leo had the still greater resources of the papacy. To detail all that he did in the patronage of literature and art would fill a volume. The same effect was produced at Rome as had taken place 80 years before at Florence, where his great-grandfather Cosimo became the leading man in that city. Scholars and artists flocked to Rome, where such a patron was to be found. Leo founded the University of Rome, to which he summoned a crowd of celebrated men, and which had 88 professors as teachers of various branches of learning, and he did not rest until he had, with the assistance of Marcus Masurus and Aldus Manutius, established a press at Rome for printing the works of the great authors, which, as they issued, were corrected by the celebrated Giovanni Lascaris himself, who had in his earlier years been employed in the researches of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and whom Leo now summoned to Rome to help him in this work. Ariosto speaks in glowing terms of the gifted company of poets and learned men whom Leo gathered round him. His own classical attainments were considerable, and he was justly acknowledged as a judge on all such matters. He had a passion for all books and manuscripts, both in the dead and living languages, and these he devoured with avidity, remembering and quoting their contents out of an excellent memory. Towards art his patronage was unbounded, and great as was his renown, it has been held by many that his protection of, and affection for, Raphael, who died the year before him, is, and always will be, Leo's best and noblest title to fame. The above pursuits were combined with all the amusements of an existence frankly given up to enjoying life as much as possible, and never showing from first to last any indication that a future life was to be expected. This latter is a strange trait under the circumstances, and one which had very important results. Lorenzo the Magnificent, for all his love of the pagan classical literature, and whatever he may or may not have been in conduct, never displayed this trait. But in the son whom he had helped to become head of the Church, it is a marked feature, and various eminent writers have supported the opinion of Mosheim in designating Leo X as an atheist. Not that he was by any means wanting as regards to the outward performance of his religious duties, for as to these he was most scrupulous. But both Europe in that age and Mohammedan countries in our own can show plenty of examples that the scrupulous performance of such duties is compatible with entire unbelief. So far as one can judge, on so essentially private a matter, from a man's outward conduct and expressed opinions, Leo was a simple Epicurean pagan. He was not a coarse voluptuary, but his speech on becoming pope frankly displayed his mind. Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it. And he did. Hunting and hawking parties in the Campagna, pleasant gatherings at his villa of La Magliana, convivial supper parties at Rome, the delights of literature, poetry, music, and theatrical representations, a revelry of culture as Gregorovius has called it, these things occupied the greater portion of his time. Unlike most scholars or any previous pope, Leo was greatly devoted to sport, as understood in those days, and often spent a month or more at a time absent from the papal city, either fishing or pheasant shooting round the lake of Bolsena, or staying at his favorite hunting lodge of La Magliana, 5 miles from Rome, in the fever-laden valley of the Tiber, taking part in the grand battues of stags, wild boar, and every sort of game, and scandalizing the papal master of ceremonies by appearing in hunting costume, and worst of all, in long riding boots. When in Rome, his life was a less healthy one. The Venetian ambassador at his court has described the ponderous and unwholesome banquets, lasting for hours, and in their lavish profusion and variety of incongruous dishes, reminding us of the feasts of the Roman emperors of antiquity. And Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua, who was the Pope's guest during the winter of 1514, has graphically detailed how she and her maids of honor were plunged into a perpetual round of banquets, balls, processions, hunting parties, popular festivals, and dramatic performances. End of section 33. Section 34 of the Medici, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Medici, Volume 1 by G. F. Young. Chapter 8, Giovanni, Leo X, Part 2. Occupied in this constant succession of festivities, field sports, and literary and artistic delights, Leo led an easy, jovial existence, troubling himself as little as might be with political affairs, and leaving the heavier burdens of the papacy, whose course was at that epoch becoming from day to day more thickly strewn with rocks and shoals, to be borne by his cousin Giulio. In 1515, the Emperor Maximilian's grandson Charles, then 15, was invested with the government of Flanders, his father Philip having died in 1506. His genealogy is important, and was as follows. Maximilian of Austria married Mary of Burgundy, only child of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. They gave birth to Philip, Archduke of Austria, and heir of Flanders through his mother. Philip married Joanna, Queen of Spain and Naples, and the daughter of Ferdinand, King of Aragon, and Isabella, Queen of Castile, and sister to Catherine, married to Henry VIII of England. Philip and Joanna gave birth to Charles V, married to Isabella, daughter of the King of Portugal. Ferdinand, King of Bohemia. Eleonora married 1. the King of Portugal, and 2. Francis I of France, and Mary, married to Louis, King of Hungary. In 1516, Ferdinand of Spain died, and Charles was invested with the government of Spain and Naples in place of his mother Joanna, who was set aside, being mad. In the same year, the 8 Years' War, begun by the League of Cambrai, was brought to an end by the Treaty of Noyeux between Francis and Charles, which left France in possession of Lombardy, and Spain in possession of Naples and Sicily. In 1519 the Emperor Maximilian died, and Charles succeeded to the crown of Austria and Flanders. There ensued 5 months' rivalry between Francis I of France, Henry VIII of England, and Charles of Austria, as to which of them should be elected emperor. Finally, Charles was elected. Thus Charles V inherited Austria from his grandfather Maximilian, Flanders from his grandmother, Mary of Burgundy, Spain and Naples from his grandfather Ferdinand and his grandmother Isabella, and the imperial title, with such dominions as still remained to it, by the election of the German Diet. The result of his election as emperor was a contest between the three rivals which lasted for 28 years, in which Francis and Charles were always opponents, and Henry sided sometimes with one and sometimes with the other. In 1520, Charles V visited Henry VIII in England in May, and in June Francis I and Henry VIII held the meeting known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold to cement their friendship. In 1521, Francis declared war against Charles, invading simultaneously Luxembourg from one side of France and Navarre from the other. Henry, led by Wolsey, sided with Charles. The atmosphere of cultured paganism which Leo X created around him in the Vatican was unique, and it has been too well described by Ranke to be given in any other words. He says, "At that time, men sought to emulate the ancients in their own language. Leo X was an especial patron of this pursuit. He read the well-written introduction to the history of Jovius, Volume 1, 2d, aloud in his circle of intimates, declaring that since the works of Livy nothing so good had been produced. A patron of the Latin improvisators, we may readily conceive the charm he would find in the talents of Vida, who could set forth a subject like a game of chess in the full tones of well-cadenced Latin hexameters. A mathematician, celebrated for expounding his science in elegant Latin, was invited from Portugal. In this manner he, Leo, would have had theology and church history written. It was in his presence that the first tragedy was performed, and also the first comedy produced in the Italian language, and this notwithstanding the objectionable character of a play that imitated Plautus. Ariosto was among the acquaintances of his youth. Machiavelli composed more than one of his works expressly for him. His halls, galleries, and chapels were filled by Raphael with the rich ideal of human beauty. He was a passionate lover of music, and its sounds were daily heard floating through the palace, Leo himself humming the airs performed. Easily does life veil its own incongruities. Such a state of things was directly opposed to Christian sentiment and conviction. The schools of philosophy disputed as to whether the soul were really immortal or whether it were absolutely mortal. Nor are we to believe that these opinions were confined to a few. Erasmus declares himself astonished at the blasphemies that met his ears. Attempts were made to prove to him, a foreigner, by passages from Pliny, that the souls of men are absolutely identical with those of beasts. Such was the atmosphere in which Leo X passed his life as Pope. And if this mode of life was less objectionable than that which had distinguished some of his immediate predecessors, it was not less at variance with the urgent needs of the circumstances of the time. For a storm was beginning to gather north of the Alps, destined in no long time to envelop all Europe, and to give the papacy other things to think of than light literature and the triumphs of art. The papacy had fallen to one who neither outraged the world by crime and immorality, like Sixtus IV and Alexander VI, nor harassed mankind by perpetual war, like Julius II. But the causes which had long been tending towards a revolt from the papacy were still steadily at work, and, as the results of the invention of printing increased, were ever gathering greater strength. Printing presses did not only reproduce the Greek and Latin works of pagan poets, and the ancient manuscripts, unearthed by ardent research, included the writings of Irenaeus and Tertullian, Cyprian and Basil, no less than those of Cicero and Pliny, Tacitus and Livy. The work of Cosimo and Lorenzo was now about to produce results which they had never anticipated. The new learning was no longer confined to Florence or to Italy. It had spread far and wide, carrying with it to Germany, to Flanders, to Switzerland, to France, and to England the knowledge of the fraudulent basis on which the papal claim to supremacy in the Church rested, the knowledge of a Christian age in which there had been no papacy, and all bishops had been of equal rank and authority, and the knowledge of a pre-existing scheme of Christian doctrine not overlaid by the errors and corruptions which had subsequently grown up in the Church at Rome. And as this knowledge spread, wider and stronger grew the determination to end the existing state of things in the Church, to cast off the usurped supremacy of Rome, and to return to a purer form of Christianity. Not that the Roman Church is to be justly charged with all that her opponents asserted. The power developed by the papacy had, in its time, done great things for religion. During a large part of the earlier Middle Ages, the papacy was the sole authority in Europe which stood for justice and righteousness, and had it not possessed the power it gradually developed, it would have been unable to withstand effectively, as it did, the almost universal unrighteousness in high places. But that time was long past, and for at least 2 centuries the papacy had only made use of its power for purposes of worldly aggrandizement, with results that caused the condemnation which it incurred to be fully deserved. The gradual spread of this newly acquired knowledge, following on the failure of all efforts to obtain reform by means of a general council, had by degrees made men ready, as soon as opportunity should occur, to fly to arms to obtain that reform which it was evident was to be gained in no other way. This effect had been steadily growing during the pontificate of Sixtus IV, Innocent VIII, Alexander VI, Julius II, and Leo X. But so little did these popes realize the conditions of the case that they seemed, by the kind of life they led, bent upon bringing about that appeal to arms. They were bishops of the leading see of Western Christendom, yet anything more opposed to the ideal life of a bishop, whether measured by the standard of the earliest centuries of the Church's life, or by that of our own age, than were their lives, it would be hard to conceive. And so the natural result followed in a conflagration which brought cruel wars and innumerable sufferings upon mankind, and tore the civilized world asunder for 150 years, but in the end cleansed Christendom. And here we come upon one of those strange revelations, impossible for anyone at the time to have seen, but which history, throwing its light back upon events long past, every now and then shows to those who come afterwards. From the time of Cosimo we see 4 successive generations of the Medici, the very last family to wish to bring about such a movement as the Reformation, and the very family out of which were to come the 2 popes who were the leading opponents of that movement, eagerly engaged in pursuing a course which made them, little as they dreamt it, the chief agents in producing that great revolt from the papacy. For it was not Luther, but the new learning which produced the Reformation. A very little consideration will show that no single individual, much less one placed in so obscure a position as Luther, could have produced a convulsion which shook all Europe from end to end. What Luther did was to set light to materials which were ready to take fire. And this new learning was created, nourished, fostered, and endowed chiefly by the Medici. It is strange indeed to note what energy they devoted, and what wealth they expended through a period of 80 years on that which was to bring upon the papacy such dire results, and to do so during the very time that the papal throne was occupied by the 2 members of this family who in turn sat upon it. Of the 5 popes who have been named, Leo X was the one against whom mankind had by far the fewest accusations to bring. It was, however, his fate to take the action which finally precipitated the crisis. The legacy which Julius II had left him of building a new St. Peter's caused such a heavy drain on the resources of the papacy that it became necessary to find some unusual means for raising funds. Accordingly, in 1517 Leo published a bull declaring that the Pope has the power of granting indulgences affecting the state of souls after death, and that this doctrine was an essential article of belief. And this was followed by the scandalous measure of the sale of these indulgences, thus starting a traffic in holy things which roused northern Europe to a pitch of indignation such as even the crimes of Alexander VI had failed to call forth. Obviously, one who doubted whether souls were immortal would find no difficulty in declaring his power to grant such indulgences, or in selling them to anyone who would give money for them. And it is very probable that Leo felt astonished at the uproar which his action aroused. Upon the issue of this bull by the Pope, Luther published and nailed up on the door of the principal church at Wittenberg his celebrated theses against both the sale of indulgences and all the additions which had been made to the theory and practice of indulgences during the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, with all they involved. The system of indulgences, with the doctrines on which it was based, was no new invention of Leo X. It had existed for at least 300 years, and Leo only redeclared it. But the new learning had caused the temper of men's minds to change, and the new departure of the sale of such indulgences came just when men were least disposed to endure it. The conflagration quickly spread. Germany was soon in a blaze, and Flanders and Switzerland showed signs of following suit. Luther proceeded to rouse all men against the iniquities of the papacy, and to urge the assembly of a general council to purge the Church, and at length, in June 1520, he published his celebrated Appeal to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation. 4,000 copies were distributed with the greatest rapidity, the printers working while Luther wrote, and it immediately produced a strong impression throughout Germany. At the same time, from the other side, Leo published in all countries his bull of 1520, condemning the doctrines of Luther, calling upon all princes and peoples to seize him and his adherents, and excommunicating all who might harbor them. This bull, Luther, protected by the Elector of Saxony, publicly and solemnly burnt at Wittenberg. And so began a conflict which was to last for generations, splitting countries, nations, and even families asunder, and having far-reaching effects which are still extending. In the following year, Leo, anxious to drive the French out of Italy, deserted Francis and engaged to join Charles in an attempt to regain Milan. The imperial and papal forces were commanded by the Marquis of Pescara, and in November 1521 Milan was captured. The news reached Leo at his villa of La Magliana at the 22nd November, and filled him with the greatest joy. But the same evening he caught a chill on returning hot and tired from the chase. Fever set in, he returned to the Vatican, grew rapidly worse, and died on 1st December. There was, as usual, a suspicion that his death was due to poison, and Castiglione, who was with him at Magliana, at first believed this, but the post-mortem examination which was held failed to confirm the suspicion. And in view of the excessively malarious character of the locality of Magliana, nothing could be more probable than that malarial fever contracted at the place where he so often resided should eventually be the cause of his death. Leo X was 45 when he died. He was buried at first in the Vatican. The result of Julius II's action in regard to St. Peter's was that neither he himself nor any of the 3 popes after him could be buried there, and for several years no tomb was erected to Leo X. But after the death of Clement VII, 1534, it was decided that these 2 Medici popes should be interred in the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, whereupon Cardinal Ippolito de' Medici removed Leo X's remains from the Vatican to that church, and commenced the erection of the tombs of the 2 Medici popes, Leo X and Clement VII, which are to be seen there. After Ippolito's untimely death in 1535, these tombs were completed by Leo X's sister, Lucrezia Salviati. It would have been hard if the Medici, the greatest of all patrons of art, and belonging to art's own special home, Florence, should not have been able to show us a unique succession of portraits of themselves, executed by the leading painters of their day. And in Leo X's case, none other could of course be employed to paint his portrait than his own great protégé and favourite, Raphael. and so Raphael has given us one of the most celebrated portraits in existence, that of Leo X with his two first cousins, Giulio de' Medici and Luigi Rossi, which hangs in the Pitti Gallery. And it tells us much of Raphael's own character to note that even though he is entirely dependent upon this great patron, yet he will not flatter him, and we feel that we have the man to the life placed before us. Easy-going, jovial, indolent, luxury-loving, shrewd, and worldly wise, all this he was, and just so does Raphael depict him. His tendency to fat was not altogether his fault. He had it throughout life, and endeavored to combat it by outdoor pursuits, and it was on the advice of his physicians that he carried these on even after he became pope, notwithstanding the shock that it gave to the ideas held by the papal officials as to what was becoming in a pope. His love of learning is indicated in the picture by the book which he has just been studying, his love of all forms of art, both by the illuminations of the book and by the highly chased silver bell, and his indifferent eyesight, which was proverbial, by the spectacles and the magnifying glass, which latter Jovius says he used on all occasions. Of the two cardinals shown with him, Giulio is the one standing at the right hand of the Pope, who seems to be listening to his advice, their respective attitudes through life. Giulio's clever and intelligent, yet cold, hard face is probably a much better likeness of him than that afterwards painted by Andrea del Sarto. Luigi Rossi was the Pope's secretary. The picture is not only notable for its portraiture, but also as a wonderful study of the combination of colors, the whole, except the Pope's white robe, being in various shades of crimson and red. Exaltation to the papacy is probably the severest trial to character which this world holds, and it was one which Leo was not able to bear. A steady deterioration in his character from the time that he became pope is the most marked feature in him. Many-sided, like all his family, he was a remarkable mixture of good and bad points, but in the end the latter predominated. End of section 34.
Section 35 of the Medici, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Medici, Volume 1 by G. F. Young. Chapter 14. The 20 Months Pontificate of Adrian VI, 1522 through 1523. Adrian VI did not belong to the Medici family, but as his short pontificate of 20 months spans the period between the two Medici popes, and is important with reference to their history, it is desirable to detail briefly the events of his reign. On the death of Leo X, an unusual amount of discord took place at the conclave assembled to elect a new pope. Giulio de' Medici, having been the late pope's adviser in everything, counted on succeeding him, and employed all the arts of which he was a master to get himself elected. But out of the 39 cardinals assembled, as many as 18 wanted the office themselves, and Giulio was only able by all his efforts to get together a party of 14. Wolsey was also a candidate, and had for a long time been swaying the politics of England in favor of Charles V in the latter's struggle with Francis I, so as to obtain in return the emperor's influence on his behalf at this election. With the emperor's candidate in possession of 7 votes, with Giulio de' Medici in possession of 14, and with the remaining 18 cardinals each striving to gain votes for himself, the conclave became a scene of the most disgraceful party struggles, and the discord was so great that it seemed as though no conclusion would ever be reached. At last Giulio's party, merely as an expedient for wearying out their opponents, voted one morning at the daily scrutiny for the most unlikely man they could think of, Cardinal Adrian Dedel of Utrecht, Archbishop of Tortosa, who had been the emperor's tutor at that time governing Spain as Charles V's representative. To their amazement and disgust, a majority of the other cardinals, seeing that they could not succeed themselves, and in order to defeat Giulio's party, at once voted the same, and to the astonishment of all Europe, one who had never been dreamt of by any one for such an office, and had made no candidature for it, became pope. Thus did the sad and serious Adrian and earnestly religious Fleming succeed to the throne so recently occupied by the cultured Epicurean Leo. If all Europe had been searched, a more startling contrast to the latter could not have been found. The new pope at once gave evidence of his temperament by declining to follow the custom which had so long prevailed of changing his name, preferring to adhere to the practice of the earlier centuries in this respect. Giulio de' Medici, having thus failed, departed to Florence and took over the charge of Florentine affairs. The absence of any opposition to his doing so shows that no doubt was felt as to the tacit right of a Medici to control the government of Florence, and this undoubtedly rested on solid ground, and was due to the instinctive feeling that Florentine affairs only went smoothly when a Medici was at the helm. Passerini's inefficient administration had gradually created considerable discontent. Financial affairs were in disorder, and much discord prevailed. But Giulio de' Medici, wanting in so many other respects, had just one good quality, inheriting in full measure that special gift, conspicuous in this family and generation after generation, of a genius for pacifying the angry passions of Florentine political life. By his conciliatory manner, careful attention to public affairs, and knowledge of the feelings of the Florentines, he soon put an end to the prevailing discord, and under his guidance Florentine affairs were satisfactorily administered. It was the universal opinion that never since the city had been under the rule of the Medici had it been governed with greater appearance of civil liberty or more skilful concealment of despotism. Nardi's remark shows that Giulio was still carefully pursuing his scheme, and biding his time until those of the family who were then children should be grown up, and he himself in a position to adopt a more rigorous attitude towards Florence than that of merely controlling her government. Meanwhile, Adrian VI was showing himself a pope such as Rome had not seen for many centuries. He was not only virtuous and frugal, humble and pious, a hater of pomp, and simple and straightforward in character, but he also viewed with indignation the corruption which abounded in the Church, and set himself vigorously to the task of reform. There was a prompt end to all the pleasant ways which Rome loved, and a volte-face which was in some of its aspects almost comic. Bishops, to whom life at a distance from Rome was like banishment to a barbarous country, were sent off to their neglected bishoprics. The sycophantic throng of poets, philosophers, artists, and musicians who had surrounded Leo were swept out of the Vatican. The supper parties, hunting parties, and convivial gatherings came to an abrupt end. The Pope insisted on living in the simplest fashion, with a very small establishment, and spent a great part of his time in prayer and study. Rome was consumed with an unutterable disgust. Moreover, whereas it had been a main object with every preceding pope to aggrandize his family and increase the papal dominions, Adrian VI refused to do anything of the kind. He restored Urbino to its rightful duke, Francesco della Rovere, and gave back to the Duke of Ferrara the territories which Leo X had taken from him. Such acts increased his unpopularity. Adrian, however, was unmoved by the indignant wrath of the corrupt community by which he was surrounded. He set before himself three main objects: the reform of the Church, the restoration of peace in Germany, and the defense of Christendom against the Turks. That he lived too short a time to effect any of these objects does not detract from the honor due to him for having earnestly and by wise methods striven to attain them. Contemporary historical events, 1521 through 1523. In 1521 the Diet of the Empire was assembled by Charles V at Worms to consider how to check the growth of the new opinions in religion which were causing so much conflict in Germany, with the result that Luther was placed under the ban of the empire. In 1522 Charles V again visited England. Henry VIII, urged on by Wolsey, who still hoped for the emperor's assistance at the next papal election, which all felt could not be far distant, now deserted the side of Francis, which he had lately been favouring, and took that of Charles. Meanwhile, Solyman, the Turkish Sultan, after invading Hungary and taking Belgrade, turned his victorious arms against Rhodes, which, held by the Knights of St. John, had been the bulwark of Christendom against the Turks since the fall of Constantinople. Adrian VI appealed earnestly to Charles, Francis, and Henry to lay aside their quarrels and unite to save Rhodes from the Turks. But they were too occupied with their mutual jealousies, and the story of Constantinople was repeated. After a stubborn resistance of 6 months, Rhodes was to capitulate. Charles gave Malta to the Knights of St. John, and they retired there. In this year, 1522, the conquest of Mexico added yet further to Charles' Spanish dominions. In 1523, Francis I carried the war into Lombardy, and dispatched a large force thither under Bonaparte. At the same time, swayed by his vicious mother, Louise of Savoy, he by various insults drove into rebellion the best general that he had, Charles, Duke of Bourbon, Constable of France, who, relentlessly persecuted by Louise because he would not marry her, and deprived of his position in the French army, at last in desperation deserted his country and offered his services to Charles V. In his endeavours to reform the Church, Adrian VI showed both wisdom and vigour. Not only did he insist on a reform of their ways by the bishops, who had so long brought discredit upon their office, but he also set himself with all his power to heal the discord in Germany by searching out the cause of the disease and the remedy required. For 120 years Europe had cried out for a reform of the Church in head and members. 3 great councils had been assembled, and all the power of the laity throughout Europe put forth to effect this reform, but all had been foiled by the head, which refused to admit that it needed reformation. Adrian VI for the first time struck a different note. He ordered Aegidius of Viterbo, the learned principal of the Augustinian order and the most pious man of intellect at that time in Rome, to furnish him with his opinion as to the disease and its remedy. In response to which, Aegidius drew up the great document in which he showed the disease to be due to the misuse of papal power, and that the remedy was a limitation of the absolutism of the head of the Church. Adrian VI agreed with the views expressed, and the result was the celebrated set of instructions issued by him in 1522 to the nuncio Chieri Regato, in which the Pope declared that the disease had spread from the head to the members, from the Pope to the bishops and cardinals. He wrote, "We have all sinned, there is not one that doeth good," and announced his determination to carry out a radical reform. Had Adrian VI lived longer, widespread results must have ensued from such an edict emanating from such a source. But it was not to be, and when the grave closed over Adrian VI, the last non-Italian pope, it closed also over all chance of a reform of the head and members conducted by the head himself. Not, however, that Adrian VI took the Protestant side by any means. He was both learned enough and wise enough to see the error of both sides, and he met the fate of all who were able to do this, and are honest enough to let both know it. To the Diet of the Empire, then assembled to discuss the subject, he addressed a most powerful protest against the doctrines of Luther, while in the same document acknowledging candidly and in the most positive terms the corruptions of which Luther and his followers accused the Church of Rome, and showing that he was determined to eradicate them. Adrian VI presented the almost unique instance in that age of a man of the humblest birth who had risen in the Church solely through the great respect entertained by his profound theological learning. and this justly deserved reputation, joined to his candid acknowledgment of the corruptions of the Church, with the stringent measures he was taking to extirpate them, made his protest against the new doctrines, and his demonstration of the ignorance on which they were to a large extent based, far more forcible than that which any other pope of that time could have made. Whereas others maintained such doctrinal points by appeals to this or that precedent, Adrian did so out of his own knowledge as a theologian. Thus the gentle and humble Adrian condemned Luther's opinions much more sharply than Leo X had ever done, while he also passed severe censures upon the princes of Germany for allowing them to spread owing to their own ignorance and their attaching greater importance to political contests than to religion. Truly many centuries had passed away since any head of the Roman Church had spoken in this fashion, or had been animated by sentiments like these. But in that corrupt age a pope of this type was obnoxious to all parties. He was obnoxious to the followers of Luther for disagreeing with their doctrines, to the princes of Germany, who, as he rightly said, only paid heed to the matter so far as they could make use of it for a political purpose, to the cardinals, who bitterly resented reforms which robbed them of all for which they cared, and above all he was intensely obnoxious to the Roman people, who loved a pope who spent money freely and was troubled with no inconvenient morality. Both of the two latter parties looked upon Adrian VI and his ways with a horrified disgust too deep for words. The change from the one extreme to the other, from the easy-going, lavishly generous Leo to the austere reformer Adrian, was too bitter a contrast. A pope who admitted that the Church needed a reform and was bent on carrying it out was altogether insupportable. Of course his end was certain. Rome wanted no popes of this sort, and would not endure them. That he existed even so long as 20 months is extraordinary. At the end of that time he was poisoned, unless there should be any doubt of the fact, or of their great relief thereat. The Roman people on the night after his death adorned his chief physician's house with garlands, and with the inscription written over them, "To the deliverer of his country." Thus ended Adrian VI, who, had his lot been cast in other times, would have accomplished much for the Church. He died on the 14th September 1523, and was buried in the church of Santa Maria della Anima, and the epitaph written for his tomb by his faithful friend and companion, Cardinal Inkelfort, was certainly suitable. Pro dolor quantum refert in quae tempora vel optimi cojuste vertas incidat. End of section 35.
Section 36 of the Medici, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Medici, Volume 1 by G.F. Young. Chapter 15. Giulio, Clement VII. Born 1478. Pope 1523 to 1534. Died 1534. 1. The first 4 years of his pontificate. Clement VII has generally been looked upon as a more or less feeble intriguer, humbly carrying out, during the pontificate of his cousin Leo X, plans originated by the latter, and involved in disasters in his own pontificate owing to want of ability. How far from the truth is the first portion of this view of him has already been shown. While, as regards the second portion, it will be seen in the sequel that the disasters in question, far from being due to any want of ability, were deliberately incurred for the sake of a single, definite object, which governed all his actions. Giulio de' Medici, son of the Giuliano killed in the Pazzi conspiracy, was tall and good-looking, spare in figure, of agreeable manners, and, except his uncle Lorenzo the Magnificent, was the cleverest of all this able family. Ranke, speaking of him after he became pope, says, He spoke with equal knowledge of his subject, whether that were philosophy and theology, or mechanics and hydraulic architecture. In all affairs he displayed an extraordinary acuteness. The most perplexing questions were unravelled, the most difficult circumstances penetrated to the very bottom, by his extreme sagacity. No man could debate a point with more address, and he manifested a circumspect ability in practice which none could surpass. At the same time he was, as we have seen, of a cold-hearted and crafty disposition, and absolutely unscrupulous, with none of those qualities of kind-heartedness, magnanimity, and cheerful bonhomie which in the case of his cousin, Leo X, helped to balance great faults. In this member of the family we see the Medici reaching their highest importance in the politics of Europe, and their history becoming, for a time, to the large extent that of Europe. But more than this, we see in him one who turned this family from those aims which his ancestors had followed, who set it upon a path where even success could confer no glory, and who, leading it to strive after an ignoble aim, brought upon the name of Medici obloquy and condemnation, where before it had won honour and esteem. This course of action, already steadily pursued by Giulio ever since the family were reinstated in Florence, was now to have a greater development. Upon the death of Adrian VI, the same disgraceful scenes which had characterized the previous conclave were repeated, and this time they lasted much longer. For 7 weeks the bribing and intriguing continued, Giulio's 2 chief antagonists being Wolsey and Alessandro Farnese. At length, on the 19th November, Giulio triumphed, and was elected Pope, assuming the name of Clement VII. He was then 45 years old. On becoming Pope, the first point which Giulio, now Clement VII, had to settle was how to retain the rule of Florence in the elder branch of the family, seeing that he himself could no longer reside there, that Lorenzo's only child was a girl of 4 years old, and that Giuliano's son, Ippolito, was too young at present to be entrusted with authority. Under these circumstances, Clement decided for the present to delegate the control of Florentine affairs to Cardinal Passerini as his representative. Accordingly, Passerini was, in May 1524, sent to Florence, and for the next 3 years Florentine affairs were administered by him under orders from Rome, though the Signoria continued to be ostensibly the ruling body. With Cardinal Passerini, Clement also sent Giuliano's son Ippolito, now a handsome, intelligent, and attractive youth of 15, who was looked upon by all as destined to succeed to the authority exercised by his father 12 years before with such satisfaction to the Florentines. He took up his abode with Cardinal Passerini at the Medici Palace, assumed the title of Il Magnifico, and was elected a member of the government. A few months later there was also sent to Passerini's charge, from Naples, where he had been brought up, another boy, Alessandro, then about 13, who now for the first time appears in connection with Florence, and whose woolly hair and negro-like appearance had already caused him to be called the Moor. This boy's origin was a secret. Born during the time that the family were in exile, he was in reality the son of Clement himself, but the latter had hidden the fact, and kept the boy out of sight as long as he could. Subsequently, after Giuliano, Lorenzo, and Leo X were all dead, Clement brought this boy forward as an illegitimate son of Lorenzo. The fact that Clement had not yet begun to make this claim, and to pass Alessandro off as Lorenzo's heir, at the time when he first became Pope, is corroborated by what took place on that occasion. For when Clement, on becoming Pope, consulted the envoys of Florence as to what he should do with regard to that state, 3 of them advised him to give the supreme power to a gonfaloniere, appointed from year to year, until Ippolito was old enough to rule. It is significant that it was Ippolito who was mentioned, and not Alessandro, as must have been the case had the latter been declared at this time to be the heir of Lorenzo. It was not until 3 or 4 years later that Clement devised the scheme of passing over Ippolito in favour of Alessandro, giving, as a reason, that he was Lorenzo's son. The 11 years' pontificate of Clement VII, 1523 to 1534, was a troubled time in Europe. The triangular duel which Charles V, Francis I, and Henry VIII carried on lasted for 26 years, never ceasing until Francis and Henry both died in the same year, 1547, and during the first half of this long struggle it was Clement VII who kept this contest alive. The latter, during the whole of his reign as Pope, was employed in prosecuting vast schemes of diplomacy, all with the object of playing off Francis against Charles, to prevent their combining against himself, and of effecting his own designs while pretending to favour each of theirs in turn. Thus, whereas Adrian VI had striven to create peace between them, Clement's whole aim was to inflame their animosities to the utmost. In this he succeeded only too well, and by their unceasing wars large portions of Europe were laid waste, ravaged by ruthless and undisciplined armies, whose track was like that of a pestilence. It is curious to note the sanguine expectations which were formed when Clement VII succeeded to the papal throne, and how strangely they were falsified. It was anticipated that his pontificate would show all that had been best in that of Leo X, while avoiding its defects. Belonging to a family so renowned for their patronage of literary and artistic culture, and being himself fond of art, culture, music, and the conversation of learned men, it was confidently asserted that there would be a restoration of that culture which had been put to flight by his predecessor, while from his sober temperament it was presumable that there would be none of that extravagance and luxury which had marked the reign of Leo X. Lastly, of his great administrative ability there was no doubt. He had ruled Rome well in Leo's day, while at Florence he had, on 2 separate occasions, put an end to dissensions, reorganized the finances, and given general satisfaction in the midst of discordant elements. There appeared, therefore, every ground for the confident expectation entertained that his pontificate would be an unusually satisfactory one. Yet the result was extraordinarily the reverse. The difficulties surrounding him on becoming pope, and the qualities he possessed for meeting them, are thus described by Trollope. The time was a difficult one for any pope, but a straight course along an open road would have been less congenial to the talents and temperament of Giulio de' Medici than one where intrigue, craft, and wily policy were necessary, and the situation was one exactly suited to his talents and disposition. Calm, moderate, unimpassioned, active, vigilant, astute, with nothing genial, large, or noble about him, but decorous, correct, and eminently respectable, while at bottom thoroughly unscrupulous, it might have been thought that Clement was just the man for the occasion, and that he, if any man, was bound to rise a winner from the slippery game of the politics of the time. Yet the result was such that his pontificate has been called the most disastrous of any pontiff who ever sat on the papal throne. Clement was not long in showing what would be the general character of his policy. Soon after he became pope, the emperor, anxious to bring about that reform of the Church which Adrian VI had not been given time to effect, began to suggest the assembly of a general council. Clement professed entire agreement, but by plausible stipulations contrived to create difficulty after difficulty in the emperor's path, hoping meanwhile that the pressure of war would soon give the latter other matters to attend to. This result soon followed, and during the next 4 years Clement's endeavours to keep the two great rivals at feud were so successful that widespread war swept backwards and forwards in turn over Burgundy, northern France, southern France, Savoy, northern Italy, and southern Italy. Clement at first took the side against Francis, who was beset with difficulties. 3 armies had entered France, a Spanish force advancing into Languedoc, a German one entering France on the northeast, and an English one occupying Picardy. On the other hand, a large French army under Bonnivet had, as already noted, invaded Lombardy. Charles's armies in northern and southern France were repulsed by the French, but in Lombardy, where the imperial army was commanded by Lannoy, Viceroy of Naples, with whom were Pescara and Bourbon, the French suffered serious reverses. All through these wars the Spanish generals were superior to the French. Francis had no good general, and suffered perpetually from the irretrievable loss he had caused himself by having driven from his service Charles, Duke of Bourbon. In 1524 the French army in Lombardy was at length forced by Lannoy to commence a disastrous retreat toward France, and in this retreat was severely defeated at the passage of Sesia, where the Chevalier Bayard, the knight sans peur et sans reproche, who commanded the rear guard of Bonnivet's army, was mortally wounded and died on the field. The imperial army, driving the French before it, advanced into southern France, and laid siege to Marseille. Francis, as though the ordinary miseries of war were not enough, met this invasion by laying waste the whole of Provence, the garden of southern France, in order that the invading army might be unable to subsist. The entire population of the district was made to move elsewhere. Villages were razed to the ground, cattle driven off, crops destroyed, and the sufferings of the people were almost as great as though they had been the captives of a hostile force. By this measure the imperial army, after heavy losses from disease and starvation, was forced to quit France and retired again into Italy. Clement, who hitherto had encouraged Charles, now began to intrigue with Francis, and in December 1524 concluded a secret treaty with him. Meanwhile Francis, elated by his success in Provence, prepared, against the advice of his ministers and generals, and even of his mother, Louise of Savoy, to invade Lombardy, with a large army under his own command. All the flower of the French nobility flocked to join this expedition. Francis appointed his mother regent of France in his absence, and marched for Italy with the most powerful army which had till then been seen in war. At first Francis was successful. He took Milan, and then proceeded to attack Pavia, defended by the experienced Spanish general Antonio de Leyva. During 3 months Pavia sustained a most rigorous siege, everything known to the engineers of that age being employed to reduce it. Francis added strong reinforcements to his army, bringing up a large body of Swiss troops, and also receiving troops sent to join him by Clement, commanded by Giovanni delle Bandinere, now the foremost commander of his time among the Italians. Meanwhile, Lannoy, Pescara, and Bourbon were collecting troops sufficient to oppose the powerful army of Francis, and at length advanced to the relief of Pavia. A great battle was fought outside the walls on the 24th February 1525, in which the French sustained the most fatal defeat known in those times. The Battle of Pavia is the greatest military event of the 16th century. Francis I, who very nearly lost his life owing to his refusal to surrender to the Duke of Bourbon, was taken prisoner. Nearly the whole of the French nobility were either killed or captured. 10,000 men of the French army were killed, and the rest surrendered. And in a fortnight after the battle, not a Frenchman remained in Italy except those who were prisoners in Lannoy's hands. It was a crushing defeat for France, whose whole military strength had been collected in this army commanded in person by the king. Lannoy at once sent news of his victory to Charles V, who was in Spain, and shortly afterwards escorted Francis I thither as a prisoner. Clement VII, aghast at the mistake he had made, deserted Francis, and hastened to make a treaty with the emperor. But it was a hollow affair, and Clement's punishment was only postponed until the emperor had leisure for it. For one of Clement's pieces of deception at this time, Florence has reason to be glad. After the Battle of Pavia, Clement, in his terror, was anxious to propitiate Federigo Gonzaga, Marquis of Mantua, one of the emperor's chief adherents in Italy. Gonzaga expressed a desire to possess the portrait of Leo X, painted by Raphael, which was in the Medici palace at Florence. Clement promised he should have it, and wrote from Rome, ordering that the picture should be sent to the Marquis of Mantua as soon as a copy of it, which he at the same time directed to be made by Andrea del Sarto, was completed. Andrea del Sarto made so good a copy that no one could tell the difference, and this copy was sent to Mantua, purporting to be the original. Even Giulio Romano, Raphael's own pupil, did not detect the deception until it was pointed out to him, years afterwards, by Vasari. It is impossible to believe that this fraud was carried out without the secret orders of Clement VII. The result, however, is that the original remained in the possession of the Medici, and hangs with that portion of their pictures which now forms the Pitti Gallery in Florence. End of section 36. Section 37 of the Medici, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Medici, Volume 1 by G. F. Young. Chapter 15, Giulio, Clement VII, Part 2. In 1526, Francis I, after 13 months' captivity in Spain, obtained his liberty, on condition that he would restore Burgundy, would agree not to attack Milan again, and would reinstate Charles, Duke of Bourbon, in the estates of which the latter had been robbed by Louise of Savoy. Some writers have maintained that the terms were too severe, but, on the contrary, in view of the crushing victory which Charles had won at Pavia, they must be held to be exceedingly moderate. No indemnity was extorted, nor any attempt made to cripple the power of France for the future. Francis I gave his 2 sons, Francis and Henry, then respectively 10 and 9 years old, as hostages for this agreement. But as soon as he reached France, he repudiated the whole of it, and was absolved therefrom by Clement, who had resolved again to change sides, since Charles was becoming too strong. Clement now formed an alliance, which he called the Holy League, consisting of France, England, and the Pope, with Venice and Florence, to oppose Charles, to relieve Francesco Sforza, besieged in Milan by the imperial army, and to set Francis's sons at liberty. Clement expected that Francis would be the life and soul of this league. But Francis, owing to his defeat and imprisonment, had gone through such a time of distress that his spirit was for a time cowed. He desired tranquillity, and for the first time failed to be roused by the Pope's incitements. He delayed doing anything except to allow certain troops to be engaged for him by Clement in Italy. Among them the corps commanded by the latter's relative, Giovanni del Bandanere, for whom Clement was, as usual, anxious to find some fighting to do. The forces assembled by Venice and the Pope were placed under command of the Duke of Urbino, and advanced against the imperial army in Lombardy. But the Duke of Urbino, no great friend of Clement, by losing several opportunities, gave Bourbon time to bring up reinforcements to the imperial army. Bourbon immediately took command of the latter, and very soon captured Milan, and drove the allied forces to retire on Lodi. It was in these operations that Giovanni della Bandanere was killed near Mantua. While these events were taking place in France and Italy, Germany was in a state of turmoil through the conflict on the subject of religion, which had now developed into actual war. To allay these conditions, which weakened Germany at a time when it was especially necessary that she should be strong, Charles assembled the Diet of the Empire at Speyer to consider the religious differences, and this meeting of the Diet granted great toleration to Luther's opinions. So much so that the resolutions passed on this occasion came to form a sort of Magna Carta to the Protestant cause. They had a political object. The Turks were now pouring into Hungary, and the Emperor was urgent to oppose them, but could not do so as long as half his territories were torn by these dissensions. He hoped by the settlement at Speyer to get the Protestant princes of Germany to march with him against the Turks. It was, however, already too late, and in August the Turks gained a great victory over Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs, in which Louis II, King of Hungary, was killed. Though not evident at the time, we can see now that Clement VII, by his course of action, became himself the chief assistant to the cause of Protestantism. Every time he induced Francis to attack Charles, he made it more difficult for the latter to deal with the rising tide of revolt against the Church taking place in Germany, which needed all Charles's attention, and which he probably would have assuaged, or at all events greatly mitigated, had he not been forced to devote most of his attention to the defense of those parts of the empire attacked by Francis, attacks in most cases instigated or encouraged by Clement. Meanwhile, retribution was being prepared for the latter. The emperor thought it time to give him a lesson, and punish him for his various tortuous dealings. In September 1526, therefore, the emperor drew up a manifesto, systematically setting forth the treacherous manner in which the Pope had acted throughout the previous 3 years. He then instructed his agent, Moncada, to stir up the powerful family of the Colonna, who attacked and plundered the Vatican, drove Clement to take refuge in the castle of Sant'Angelo, and there made him, as a condition of his release, agree to renounce the Holy League, to withdraw his troops from Lombardy, and to give hostages for his good faith. But Clement was not to be held firm, even by the giving of hostages. As soon as he was again free, he repudiated his engagements, collected a force, attacked the territory of the Colonna, razed to the ground 14 of their castles and villages, and executed a general massacre of men, women, and children belonging to them, thus filling up the cup of his misdeeds. Then the emperor, always deliberate, and never relinquishing any purpose which he had once formed, prepared a terrible vengeance. He sent, during November and December, additional troops from Spain to Lannoy, his commander in southern Italy, and from Germany to Bourbon, his commander in northern Italy, Pescara having just died, and ordered Bourbon on their arrival to march upon the Papal States. The imperial army in Italy was composed of all the greatest ruffians from every race in Europe, Spanish and Germans predominating. They had been, for some time, deliberately kept by Charles V without pay, and the state of want to which they were reduced made these troops almost unmanageable except by Bourbon, who, from his many qualities as a general, had a wonderful power over them. Nevertheless, his position was rendered most difficult. Northern Italy, ravaged by these incessant wars, was almost a desert, and could no longer support his troops. To increase his difficulties, there now came to join his army, already in arrears of pay, this addition of 16,000 Lutheran troops from Germany, who had not only been promised their pay on reaching Lombardy and were bent upon plunder, but also came with a fixed determination to execute vengeance upon the Pope, to whose faithlessness they attributed all the woes of Christendom. To his charge were laid the long continuance of war throughout Europe, the defeats sustained from the Turks, even their own present state of privation, and they openly announced their intention of marching to Rome and hanging the Pope. Their commander, Frundsberg, ostentatiously carried with him a silken rope for this especial purpose. In January 1527, Bourbon made over the government of Milan to Antonio de Leyva, and set his army in motion southwards. On reaching Bologna, where he halted for a short time during February, a mutiny of his troops, who were now in the greatest destitution, was only pacified by his promising to march upon Rome. Clement, threatened by Bourbon from the north and Lannoy from the south, and terrified to find the same storm coming upon himself which he had brought upon so many others, sent urgent appeals to Francis to deliver him. But Francis had not yet recovered from the blow to his spirit caused by his own defeat and captivity, while he himself had certain scores to pay off upon Clement, and he made no effort to prevent matters from taking their course. Bourbon's unruly horde continued, therefore, to move slowly forwards, while Clement clamored for aid in every direction, and even offered 100,000 ducats if this would appease the Lutheran troops. but the latter were obdurate. Clement made overtures to Lannoy, who came, bringing the above sum of money to Bourbon, but more than twice that amount was due for the arrears of pay alone, and Lannoy dared not approach the camp, as the Lutheran troops, bent upon personal vengeance on the Pope, would not hear of any truce, and threatened to kill even Lannoy himself if he interfered with them, while Frensburg, their own immediate commander, was just at this time struck down by apoplexy. They were determined to hang the Pope and sack Rome, would obey no other general than Bourbon, and would not obey even him unless he led them towards Rome. So while Clement, now in the greatest terror, offered every possible and impossible concession to any who would come to his assistance, the resistless torrent rolled steadily on through the valleys of Romagna and Umbria, Bourbon subsisting his hungry and ferocious troops on the country passed through, whose inhabitants had sore reason to curse Clement for bringing this terrible visitation upon them. On the evening of the 5th May, the army encamped outside Rome, and the troops at last feasted their eyes on its palaces, and promised themselves, as the reward of all their hardships, the plunder of the papal city. Next morning Bourbon, the ferocious Bourbon, as his enemies called him, fastening upon himself the chief characteristic of the miserable material given him to command, whom his many misfortunes had made tired of life, drew up his army for the attack. He led the assault himself, ascended the first ladder placed against the walls, and fell, mortally wounded, as his victorious troops gained the city, his last act being to have himself covered with a cloak, that his soldiers might not be discouraged by seeing his condition. 6th May, 1527. Then followed the terrible sack of Rome. As the imperial army burst into the city, Clement took refuge in the castle of Sant'Angelo, while his troops were being pursued by enemies who gave no quarter, and who were doubly enraged by the death of their adored commander. And Clement was now able to see some of the results of his crafty policy and double dealing. The pandemonium which followed is indescribable. The Lutheran troops took pleasure in destroying and defiling all that the Catholic world had revered. Robertson says, "It is impossible to describe or even imagine the misery and horror of the scene that followed. Whatever a city taken by storm can dread from military rage unrestrained by discipline, whatever excesses the ferocity of the Germans, the avarice of the Flemings, or the licentiousness of the Spaniards could commit, these wretched inhabitants of Rome were obliged to suffer. Churches, palaces, and houses were plundered without distinction. No age or character was exempt from injury. Cardinals, nobles, priests, matrons, virgins, were all the prey of the soldiers, and at the mercy of men deaf to the voice of humanity. Nor did these outrages cease, as is usual in towns carried by assault, when the first fury of the storm was over. The imperial army, unable to be controlled by any general now Bourbon was dead, kept possession of the city for many months, and during all that time the brutality of the soldiers continued. Their booty in ready money alone amounted to 1,000,000 ducats. What they raised by ransoms and exactions far exceeded that sum. Rome, though taken various times by the northern nations in the 5th and 6th centuries, was never treated with so much cruelty by the barbarous and heathen Huns, Vandals, or Goths as now by this terrible foe. While these scenes were being enacted, Clement, the author of all this, was a close prisoner in the castle of Sant'Angelo, besieged by those troops who, as he well knew, had often sworn to hang him, and were now uncontrolled by the only general who had had any power over them. On Bourbon's death, the command devolved upon Philibert, Prince of Orange, but the troops made no pretense of obeying him, and it was with difficulty that he could even persuade some of them to desist from plunder and invest the castle of Sant'Angelo. The Duke of Urbino advanced with an army consisting of Venetians, Florentines, and Swiss, in the pay of Francis I, strong enough to have overpowered the army of the Prince of Orange. But the Duke of Urbino had an old score to pay off against Clement, since the time when the latter had helped to rob him of his duchy. So to tantalize him by raising false hopes in his mind, he merely brought his army near enough for Clement to see it, and then marched away, leaving him surrounded by the furious enemies who thirsted for his blood. The emperor courteously expressed sorrow at the pope's misfortune, but the imperial army remained where it was. Nor, in fact, could any power have removed it, for the troops found Rome exceedingly pleasant quarters, and had not the slightest intention of obeying any order to quit the city, so long as anything remained to eat or to plunder. Clement continued besieged by them in the castle of Sant'Angelo for 7 months, and his action, when, reduced to great straits, he bade Cellini, who was with him there, to melt down his tiara, was symbolical of the position to which he had brought himself. At length he contrived to escape, disguised as a peddler, and fled in miserable plight, and with only one attendant, to Orvieto, where he arrived in a most forlorn state, destitute of everything, a disastrous conclusion to 4 years of tortuous scheming. 8th December, 1527. The imperial army remained firmly planted in Rome, and seemed likely to take root there for good. Lannoy succeeded the Prince of Orange in command, but died of the plague. All the splendor of the Rome of Leo X was destroyed, and when, after 9 months' occupation, the army, utterly demoralized by its long debauch, was driven out of the city by the plague, they left it a ruined and desolate waste. Meanwhile, as soon as the news arrived of Pope Clement's disaster, and of his being besieged in the castle of Sant'Angelo, Florence, seeing now an opportunity of throwing off the yoke which he had long been craftily but steadily tightening upon her, revolted from his authority, and for the 3rd time banished the Medici family. 19th May, 1527. At the same time, Venice, taking advantage of the opportunity, seized Ravenna and other places in the States of the Church, and the Dukes of Ferrara and Urbino resumed possession of those territories of which the papacy had deprived them. At this juncture also, Henry VIII of England began to press Clement to grant him a divorce from his queen, Catherine of Aragon, the aunt of Charles V. But Clement was truly not just then in a position to offend Charles further, or to give attention to such matters. End of section 37. Section 38 of the Medici, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Medici, Volume 1, by G. F. Young. Chapter 16. Clarice de' Medici. Clarice Strozzi. Born 1493, married 1508, died 1528. Clarice, the second of the 2 children of Pietro the Unfortunate, and sister of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, was far more capable than either her father, mother, or brother. Her uncle Leo X used to say that it would have been well for the family if Clarice had been the man and her brother Lorenzo the woman. She had a high spirit and a strong intelligence, and frequently saved her husband from disaster by her courage and ability. Her very interesting portrait, taken when she was about 17, shows a fine, strong, intellectual face, fully in keeping with the character she afterwards displayed. Clarice's life exemplified the vicissitudes of the Medici fortunes, for during her comparatively short life the family were twice in the highest prosperity and twice in the deepest adversity. Born in the Medici palace when her family was at the height of the splendor to which it had been brought by her grandfather, Lorenzo the Magnificent, she was, when a year old, carried away from Florence, when her parents were exiled, and the whole of her girlhood was passed in the nomadic existence entailed on her family by that exile. Her father died when she was 10 years old, and when she was 15 her mother, Alfonsina, gave her in marriage to Filippo Strozzi, head of the Strozzi family, and a man of much influence both at Florence and at the papal court. Although her husband was fined and banished for this marriage with her, he was suffered to return to Florence about a year later, bringing his young bride with him. Then, when Clarice was 19, came the return of the Medici to Florence, and her uncle Giuliano became ruler of the state, and in the following year that rule passed to her brother, Lorenzo. Clarice was the first mistress of the handsome Strozzi Palace in the Via Tornabuoni, which, begun 20 years before, was first occupied when in 1510 she and her husband were allowed to return to Florence, though it was not finally completed until 1536. In 1513 her uncle Giovanni became pope, and being a favorite with him, Clarice was often in Rome during the years of his pontificate. In 1519, when she was 26, her brother Lorenzo died, and her distant relative, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, whom she cordially detested, came to administer Florentine affairs. And when, in 1523, he became pope, Clarice had opportunities of seeing the gradual working of his policy as regards Florence, and the change of feeling towards her family which it produced. We hear of her again in Rome in 1524, where for some time she resided, taking charge of her brother Lorenzo's only child, Catherine, then 5 years old. But in 1525, affairs in Rome, after the Battle of Pavia, becoming unsettled, Clarice returned to Florence, where she had the mortification of seeing that palace, which was associated, in her mind, with all the glory of her family, occupied by the two illegitimate scions of the family, Ippolito and Alessandro, and their guardian, Cardinal Passerini, Pope Clement's representative. In the following year, Clarice, by her boldness and resource, saved her husband's life, not the only occasion of the kind during her life. When in September 1526 the Colonna forced Clement to give hostages as a guarantee of his good faith, the latter gave as a hostage his friend Filippo Strozzi, who was then in Rome, and when Clement broke his agreement and committed his atrocious attack on the Colonna, Strozzi's life was in the greatest danger. Clarice, who had remained in Florence, much out of health, as soon as she heard this news, got into her litter, travelled with all speed to Rome, where she declared that Filippo had been basely and foully sent like an innocent lamb to the slaughter, and by her energetic action on arrival there eventually obtained her husband's liberty. Early in 1527 the storm which he had provoked burst upon Clement. He was besieged in the castle of Sant'Angelo. Florence rose in revolt against the thraldom which had been gradually imposed upon her ever since he had become the ruling spirit of the family, and for the third time in their history the Medici were banished. On this occasion Clarice gave full evidence of her strength of character and lofty spirit. Filippo, her husband, unable to decide which side to take, remained shut close in his palace, full of doubt and uncertainty. No such feelings oppressed his high-spirited wife. Clarice, justly hating Clement VII, was not at all displeased at seeing him brought to disgrace and disaster. The more pride she took in her ancestors, the more wrath she felt at the course being pursued by the existing head of the family, and she eagerly seized the opportunity of dealing a blow at his plans which might be a decisive one. She first advised her irresolute husband to stick to the side of the Republic, advice which he eventually took. Then, sallying forth to the Medici palace, the home of her ancestors, now tenanted by those whom she considered only half Medici, unworthy to be the bearers of that once honoured name, she proceeded to eject them in the following fashion. The scene in the Medici palace on that 19th May 1527, and Clarice's part therein, is thus vividly described by Trollope. In the Medici palace, after the news had come of the terrible sack of Rome, and that Pope Clement had fled and was closely besieged in the castle of Sant'Angelo, and while in the Palazzo della Signoria the Great Council, hastily assembled, and still only half determined to take the decisive step, discussed a revolution, sat the Cardinal Passerini with his 3 young charges, awaiting the decision of the council, dismayed and irresolute, while the whole length of the Via Larga outside presented to one looking on it from the Medician palace a threatening, billowy sea of heads. To them thus sitting, trembling and perplexed, entered the haughty and intrepid Clarice, bent on bringing them to a very speedy resolution. Clarice hated her relative Clement, and burnt with indignation at seeing the illegitimate Ippolito and Alessandro made inheritors of her family's honours and preeminence. Entering the room with haughty step and flashing eye, full of indignation, and raising her voice so loud that it was even heard by those in the street outside, she bitterly taunted the trembling cardinal at having brought his own and his master's affairs to such a pass, contrasting how differently things were managed by my ancestors who were true Medici, and who with benevolence and gentleness gained the loyalty of the Florentines, and so found them constant in adversity. But you, turning to Ippolito and Alessandro, who by your conduct have betrayed the secret of your birth, and convinced the world that you are not of the blood of the Medici, and not you alone but Clement also, unworthy and wrongfully Pope, and now most rightfully prisoner in Sant'Angelo, why are you surprised that all are this day against you? Now, therefore, depart from a house to which you have no claim, and from a city which has no affection for you. For in this evil hour the family honour depends on me." And this forceful lady wound up her harangue by sarcastically informing them that the Medici palace was not built in order to be a stable for mules. And promptly depart they did. As an old chronicler commenting on this episode naively remarks, "The Lady Clarice had great power of tongue." But apart from all questions of her power of tongue, there is no doubt that Clarice was abundantly right. She saw plainly Clement's scheme, and how he was, step by step, carrying it out. She saw how, as a result, the whole temper of the people of Florence was changing towards her family. She knew what a tool her brother Lorenzo had been made in his hands. Except for a girl of 8 years old, she was herself the last legitimate representative of a line of ancestors who had been actuated by far different aims, and she was enraged at seeing a policy so destructive to the honour of her house being pursued by one who, illegitimate himself, was scheming to make a second illegitimate scion of the family continue the same policy. And the speech which Leo X had uttered concerning her was, had he known it, a prophetic one, for had she been in her brother's place, Clement would have found in her a formidable antagonist. She would have found means to make the course upon which he had embarked, and which after her death produced the destruction of the Republic, an impossible one, and the family honour would not have been dragged in the dust by an action which has been the cause of all the condemnation bestowed upon their name. By her conduct on this occasion, conduct apparently impelled by a determination to maintain the honour of her family by showing the Florentines that the true Medici had neither part nor lot with Clement and his scheme for the enslavement of Florence, Clarice forced the hesitating Signoria over the Rubicon, for by this expulsion of Ippolito and Alessandro, with the Pope's representative, the die was cast, and it meant war to the knife with Clement. And Clarice's bold endeavour to defend that honour of her family which she had truly said depended only on her, was in its own sphere not unworthy to be set beside Piero Capponi's action in that same room 33 years before, when he boldly spoke for the liberty of Florence against Charles VIII. Clarice's character is a fine one. In every act of her life she showed herself a worthy descendant of those Medici who had gone before, and of whom she was so proud, and in this, the last recorded episode of her life, she showed it most. She died in the following year, on the 3rd May 1528, at the age of 35, while the Republic was still in full power, and while her husband was keeping away from Florence, and endeavouring to remain friends both with the Republic and the Pope. She died at their lovely villa of Le Selve, on the heights overlooking the valley of the Arno near Signa, and is buried in the Strozzi chapel in Santa Maria Novella, Florence. She had 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. In his life of his brother Filippo, her brother-in-law, Lorenzo Strozzi, says that at her death her husband cordially lamented her and afflicted himself much, and Filippo Strozzi in his will provided for a monument to be erected to her memory, seeing that Clarice, my wife, deserves by her virtues to be honored by me. And certainly Filippo Strozzi had every reason to honor one who was a most true, faithful, and able helpmeet to him, who throughout her life identified herself completely with his interests and plans, and took by far the larger share of the burden, and who not only worthily upheld the name of Medici, but also brought credit upon that of Strozzi. End of section 38. Section 39 of the Medici, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Medici, Volume 1, by G. F. Young. Chapter 17. Giulio, Clement VII. Born 1478. Pope 1523 to 1534. Died 1534. 2. The last 7 years of his pontificate. That Florence should revolt from him, and for a 3rd time banish his family, is said to have been more intolerable to Clement VII than even the sack of Rome, and all his other misfortunes. It was a severe blow to his long-cherished scheme. To his former plans there was now added the desire for vengeance. Meanwhile Florence was jubilant. She had reasserted her independence, and had good grounds for hoping to maintain it. Stronger as a state than Rome, the only thing she had to fear was the Pope's gaining allies, and in the condition to which Clement had brought his affairs, this seemed highly improbable. The Emperor's animosity had been thoroughly roused, and he and the Pope seemed now too hopelessly estranged to be ever likely to reunite. Francis I was Florence's ally, and besides this had, in his contest with Charles, other work for his troops than to employ them on Clement's behalf in the latter's private quarrel with Florence. Henry VIII was also Florence's ally, and incensed against Clement for his evasive replies in the matter of his divorce. Genoa, Venice, and Ferrara were all allied with Florence, while the smaller states were nearly all at enmity with Clement for one cause or another. Lastly, he himself was a fugitive, plundered of everything, and in a destitute condition. But the Florentines, notwithstanding their long knowledge of him who has been called the master of craft, had not fathomed the capabilities of that fertile brain for finding a way even through such a tangled web as this. Clement's main difficulty was that, while he could not hope to regain power over Florence without the hope of one or other of the 2 great antagonists, if he obtained the assistance of one, the other would at once take the opposite side, and so neutralize matters. How to avoid this, therefore, became a problem to the solution of which he turned all his mental powers. First, however, he had to make his peace with Charles, and get the Emperor's Spanish, Flemish, and German bulldogs, which had been so ruthlessly let loose upon him, made to let go from his throat. As the price of this release, Charles imposed upon him the most humiliating terms, including the surrender of a large part of the papal territories and the payment of a heavy fine, to all of which Clement had to submit. In February 1527, soon after Clement reached Orvieto, Francis again declared war against Charles. Henry sided with Francis, hoping thereby to secure the latter's influence with the Pope in the matter of his divorce. For Clement, now completely in the power of Charles, was secretly intriguing with Francis, and urging on this war, in the hope that it would liberate him from this state of bondage. With France and England, the other allies against Charles were Venice, Genoa, Florence, and Ferrara. Florence made a fatal mistake in the side she took in this war. Before it began, the emperor offered, if she would side with him against Francis, to secure her against the Pope, and Niccolò Capponi, who was Gonfaloniere, exerted all his influence to induce his countrymen to accept this offer, foreseeing that the Pope would eventually contrive to patch up matters with the emperor, and that whenever this occurred, Francis would prove a broken reed. But the Florentines insisted on clinging to the French alliance, and 3 years later had bitter reason to repent their mistake. As before, Italy was the principal battlefield. A French army under de Lautrec advanced against Charles's dominions in northern Italy. A second army, assisted by the Genoese fleet, attacked his kingdom of Naples, and for the next year and a half war raged throughout Italy. In October 1528, Clement, who had moved in June from Orvieto to Viterbo, was at last able to return to Rome. He was horror-stricken on seeing its condition, finding it ruined, half burnt, and the population diminished by 1/2. Meanwhile, matters were going against the French. They lost the valuable alliance of Genoa. A few months afterwards, the whole French army in southern Italy had to capitulate. And lastly, their army in northern Italy suffered a severe defeat from Antonio de Leyva. Exhausted by so many reverses, Francis was inclined to make peace, and to this end discussions regarding a treaty between the two antagonists went on for months at Cambrai, between Louise of Savoy on the part of Francis and Margaret of Austria on the part of Charles. The above position of affairs caused Clement to consider that the time was ripe for carrying out a great scheme, the details of which he had been elaborating for many months. Seldom, surely, has such vast machinery been set in motion to attain such a petty object. Europe was now to see the politics of France, England, Spain, Germany, and Italy all manipulated, in order that Clement might compass his aim of regaining power over Florence and exalting a scion of his family to be despot over it. Accordingly, in June 1529, while the endless discussions between Louise and Margaret were still continuing at Cambrai, Clement proceeded to Spain, where Charles then was, and laid before him certain proposals for their combined action. The result of this was a secret compact, concluded between Charles and himself at Barcelona towards the end of June, which soon had important results to all the countries then at war, though the arrangements made between Charles and Clement in this dubious plot were not allowed to transpire for some little time, but became apparent by degrees in the terms of the Treaty of Cambrai, and in Charles's proceedings in Italy a few months later. This compact was followed in August 1529 by the conclusion of the Treaty of Cambrai between Francis and Charles, in which Francis agreed to abandon his allies, England, Venice, Ferrara, and Florence, to pay a ransom for his sons, to withdraw his troops from all Charles's territories, and to renounce all interference in the future with affairs in Italy. The last item was the principal one, and was that which Clement had employed all his art to secure. Simultaneously with this treaty between Francis and Charles, Clement gave Henry some encouragement in the matter of his divorce, and the latter, anxious to obtain this, offered no remonstrance against the abandonment of the other allies by Francis, and himself followed the same course. This left of the original allies against Charles only Venice, Ferrara, and Florence, deserted by the rest. The above treaty, combined with the thraldom in which he held the Pope, made Charles complete master of Italy. He now proceeded for the first time to that country, where his armies had been fighting for nearly 8 years, almost uninterruptedly, to settle its affairs and to carry out the remaining provisions of the secret compact which had been made between himself and Clement. Reaching Genoa at the end of August, he proceeded to Milan, where he reinstated Francesco Sforza as duke and dictated terms of peace to Venice and Ferrara. In accordance with the secret compact at Barcelona, Charles treated Venice and Ferrara leniently, and only required from them the restitution to the Pope of the territories they had seized from him in 1527. This left Florence alone, bereft of all her allies. Genoa, France, England, Venice, and Ferrara had one by one been separated from her. Nor was Florence given any opportunity of making her peace with the emperor in the same way as Venice and Ferrara had done, for this would have prevented that destruction of her republic which was the object of all these manoeuvres on Clement's part. Moreover, another item in the Barcelona compact now transpired, for, as the price of his submission on all other points, Clement had stipulated that the imperial army should be lent to him to enable him to crush Florence, to which Charles had agreed, on Clement's pointing out that the eventual result would be to the emperor's own advantage, since, instead of a turbulent republic, there would be substituted a ruler who would be a vassal of the emperor. Thus had Clement, in a course of 2 years' intricate diplomacy, gradually got the bundle of sticks separated, and also obtained the assistance against Florence of Charles's army, for which Clement agreed to pay, while Francis, under the terms of the Treaty of Cambrai, was debarred from interfering. The sum total was a triumph of that kind of diplomacy in which Clement delighted, and in which he excelled. Accordingly, in the end of September 1529, the imperial army was ordered to march upon Florence, and in December, while the siege of Florence was proceeding, Clement and Charles met again, this time at Bologna, to perfect these arrangements, to add certain other clauses to the contract between them, and for Charles to be crowned by Clement with the imperial crown. This coronation took place on the 24th February 1530, and in April Clement returned to Rome, having, in the further clauses to their compact added at Bologna, set on foot arrangements concerning a private and domestic scheme which he was elaborating as regards his own family. He had by this time determined to supplant Ippolito by Alessandro, and to give the rule of Florence, whenever that state should be subdued, to the latter. But he kept this carefully concealed from all except the emperor until the time should come, and until he should find means to dispose of Ippolito in some manner which should prevent him from interfering with this plan. The terms of the secret compact to which Clement had induced Charles to agree at Barcelona, and which was thus finally completed between them at Bologna, were such as fully showed Clement's unscrupulous character, while in them we see that scheme at last taking shape upon which he had been for so many years bent as regards Florence, and which 2 years before had seemed as though it would have to be abandoned. The principal terms were: 1. That on Florence, being isolated from her allies by the arrangements settled upon as regarded France, England, Venice, and Ferrara, the imperial army should be lent to Clement, with which to attack and subdue her. 2. That the independence of Florence should be abolished. 3. That Alessandro, called by Clement the son of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, should be invested by the emperor with the rule of Florence, holding that state as the emperor's vassal. And 4. That Margaret, a daughter of the emperor, then 9 years old, should be married to Alessandro as soon as she should be old enough. But the 3rd and 4th articles were not allowed to transpire until more than a year later, Clement having private reasons for keeping them secret for the present. It may be imagined with what indignation the Florentines heard of this resolution to extinguish their beloved republic, and with what determination they prepared to fight to the death against it. Regarding this whole matter, Renca's comment is as follows: With astonishment did men behold him, Clement, after so many indignities, again connect himself with the emperor. He so completely changed his policy that the very army by which the horrors of the sack of Rome had been perpetrated before his eyes, and himself held so long a captive, he now called to his assistance, and launched upon his native city. Nevertheless, Florence did not lose heart, though opposed to the united power of the Pope and Emperor. Her field army was placed under Francesco Ferrucci, other troops being enrolled to form the garrison of the city. All round the walls of the city a space 1 mile wide was ruthlessly cleared, so as to afford no cover to the enemy. Every tree, including those of vineyards and fruit gardens, being cut down, and every building, including even churches, being demolished, and notwithstanding the fact that some of these suburbs were almost like towns. The Venetian ambassador, Carlo Capello, writing to his government, comments on the widespread ruin thus caused, the many beautiful villas that had been burnt by their owners, and the greatness of mind displayed by the general willingness to suffer all these losses for the sake of liberty. One exception only was made, viz. The monastery of San Salvi, on account of Andrea del Sarto's fresco of the Last Supper, which art-loving Florence had not the heart to destroy. On the 14th October 1529, the imperial army, commanded by the Prince of Orange, appeared before Florence and occupied all the high ground on the southern side, at a distance of about a mile from the walls, from near Rusciano on the east, round to Monte Oliveto on the west, while another equally large force occupied the country on the northern side of the city. Before the investment was complete, Florence sent an embassy to Clement, in Rome, to appeal to his mercy, but they met only with a cold refusal. Yet the troops whom he had gathered round Florence were the ferocious ruffians of many nationalities whom Bourbon had commanded, and Clement had hired them with 80,000 florins and the promise of the plunder of Florence. While we are told that even before this army left Lombardy, the soldiers' usual oath had become, "by the glorious sack of Florence." There was therefore no doubt as to what was the fate in store for Florence if this enemy got within her walls. Florence's struggle in defense of her independence was worthy of her former history. She defended herself for 10 months against all that the imperial army could do, and at one time it looked as though she would win. Michelangelo laid aside his chisel and became his country's principal engineer, in particular designing all the defences around San Miniato, the principal point of attack. Francesco Carducci was the gonfaloniere, and although he had not the ability of his predecessor, Niccolò Capponi, he was a worthy and patriotic head of the government. But the chief hero of the defence is Florence's noble general, Francesco Ferrucci, who well deserved the niche in Florence's temple of fame which he has gained. Keeping the field, and holding the neighbouring town of Empoli, he managed steadily to pour in thence supplies into Florence, again and again defeating the imperial detachments with his numerically inferior forces, and hampering the Prince of Orange by the knowledge that there was an army in the field on his flank. And so well did he maintain his country's cause that it became at length evident that the imperial army would never take Florence so long as Ferrucci remained unconquered. It would have been well for Florence if her forces within the city had been commanded by a man of like character. But here she had made the fatal mistake of employing a foreigner, Malatesta Baglioni, one of that blood-stained family who had previously ruled Perugia, and this caused her defeat. He was a traitor from the very first, and had sold the cause he was engaged to defend. Gino Capponi states that before the siege began, Baglioni received from the Pope a written document promising him the lordship of Perugia, confirming any terms which he might make with the Prince of Orange, and conveying absolution for all crimes which he might commit during the siege of Florence. Nevertheless, though the garrison was so badly commanded, the imperial army failed to gain any success. In the sorties and skirmishes which took place almost daily, and were fought with great ferocity, the Florentines nearly always prevailed, and in December a well-arranged sortie of 3,000 men under Stefano Colonna was so successful that the besieging army would probably have been routed, had it not been for the treachery of Baglioni, who sounded the retreat when Colonna's force was carrying all before them. Month after month the struggle continued, and by degrees one after another of Florence's subject towns were captured. Volterra, Pistoia, Prato, Lastra, San Miniato al Tedesco, and others being successively taken by the imperial army. But these losses did not daunt Ferrucci, who harassed the enemy continually, and even recaptured Volterra and San Miniato al Tedesco. At length, in July 1530, the Prince of Orange, seeing that if he was ever to take Florence, it was imperative first to defeat Ferrucci, desired to attack him with the greater part of his army, leaving only a weak force round the city. But he feared lest in his absence the garrison should sally out and defeat the force thus left behind. Baglioni, however, enabled him to effect his object, and to attack Ferrucci with an overwhelming force, by engaging not to make any such sortie during the prince's absence. Thus assured, the latter marched away with a force more than double the strength of that commanded by Ferrucci, and attacked him. The battle between them decided the fate of Florence. It was fought at Gavinana, in the mountains above Pistoia, on the 3rd August, 1530. After a severely contested battle, the imperial army won, chiefly because their brave opponents were nearly all destroyed. The two commanders, the Prince of Orange and Francesco Ferrucci, were both killed. Thereupon Florence surrendered, on condition, agreed to on Clement's part, that the ancient constitution should be preserved and the city ruled by the Signoria, but subject to the emperor as the supreme power in Italy, Florence agreeing to pay an indemnity of 80,000 florins, while the Pope agreed to treat his countrymen with affection and clemency, as he had always done. Nevertheless, as soon as the city was in possession of the Pope, these terms were entirely ignored. Francesco Carducci, the brave head of the government during the siege, Niccolò de Lapi, Fra Benedetto da Foiano, a monk who during the siege had encouraged the citizens by his sermons, and many others, Iriart states to the number of 1,000, were put to death, while many of the leading citizens were imprisoned. The abolition of the Republic and the installation of Alessandro as Duke, Clement thought, even in the beaten condition of the Florentines, would be more safely carried out by successive steps. So for a time he caused the government to be carried on by his representative, Baccio Valori, the Signoria being allowed to continue, but all power being vested in Valori, who lived in the Palazzo della Signoria, surrounded by a strong body of the imperial troops. After this arrangement had lasted 10 months, Clement took the second step, by sending Alessandro from Rome to take Valori's place. He arrived on the 5th July 1531, and took up his abode in the Medici palace. But before the final step of declaring the Republic abolished, and proclaiming Alessandro sole master of Florence, could be ventured upon, a fortress was necessary to contain the troops to support this despotism. Accordingly, for the present, Alessandro was only called head of the Republic, while arrangements were made for rapidly building a strong fortress, the present Fortezza da Basso, at the center of the northern wall of the city. Clement VII's ancestors are often accused of despotism, but they had no need of a fortress. Now, however, that a despotism is in reality about to be set up, a fortress to support it is felt to be a sine qua non, so much so that the proclamation of that despotic rule is even delayed until the fortress is ready. As soon as the latter was sufficiently completed to be occupied by the troops lent by the emperor to support Alessandro's authority, the third and final step was taken, and on the 1st May, 1532, Alessandro summoned the members of the Signoria to the Medici palace, and read out to them the emperor's order that the Signoria was abolished, the Republic ended, and he himself to be sole ruler of Florence. At the same time, a similar proclamation was made from the Ringhiera, in front of the Palazzo della Signoria, the name of which was henceforth changed to Palazzo Vecchio. Alessandro also caused the great bell, La Vacca, which hung in the tower of the Palazzo Vecchio, and had summoned so many generations of Florentines to proclaim their will, to be thrown down and broken to pieces. The bell of the council, says Davanzati in his contemporary diary, was taken from us in order that we should no more hear the sweet sound of liberty. Thus had Clement at last effected the completion of that project which he had assiduously pursued during 20 years. The further development of converting the ducal coronet into a crown was still unattained, but only one step more remained to reach it. The city, held in subjection by foreign troops, groaned in silence, but rage burnt under the surface at the manner in which its conquest had been effected, at the deliberate breach of the conditions under which it had surrendered, and at the odious tyranny to which it now found itself subjected. End of section 39. Section 40 of the Medici, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Medici, Volume 1, by G. F. Young. Chapter 17. Giulio, Clement VII, Part 2. Michelangelo, when the city surrendered, fled for his life, and remained for some time in hiding. But his talents were too valuable to be lost, and Clement wanted him for the completion of the family monuments in the new sacristy, planned in the time of Leo X. So he was pardoned, and given orders to proceed with the work. It may be imagined with what feelings he returned to the execution of such a task in the midst of the daily humiliations of Alessandro's rule. What memories of a bygone, very different state of things in the happy days of his youth under Lorenzo the Magnificent, and what despair at the present degradation of Florence oppressed his soul as he labored at these monuments, may be seen in his work. And there is no ground for the uncertainty which some have expressed as to what ideas Michelangelo meant to convey in these statues of day and night, evening and dawn, when they are studied in conjunction with the contemporary history and his own words. Footnote. Michelangelo, referring to the statue of Night, wrote, "Ah, glad I am to sleep in stone, while wrong and dire disgrace rage unreproved near. A happy chance to neither see nor hear. Oh, then wake me not. Hush, whisper low." End footnote. The great sculptor worked at the task given him full of the bitterest feelings at the ruin of his country, at the wrong which had been done to her, and at the dire disgrace of such a rule as that of Alessandro. And the statues refer to the day which once had been, and the dark night which had now settled down upon Florence, one regarding which he despaired of any dawn. Michelangelo left these monuments unfinished, not on account of any artistic reason, as some have fancied, but because, on Clement's death in 1534, before they were completed, he precipitately fled from Florence, being in fear of the tyrant Alessandro's hate when once the Pope was dead. Germany. By the year 1530, Charles V had triumphed in every direction. Spain was reduced to subjection. On France had been inflicted the greatest defeat of the century. All temporal power had been taken from the Pope. Throughout Italy, Charles's supremacy was complete, while his brother Ferdinand had gained the crowns of both Hungary and Bohemia. But in Germany, the contest about religion threatened to produce serious civil war. In 1530, Charles assembled the Diet of the Empire at Augsburg to endeavor to find means of healing the breach, and at this assembly Melanchthon put forward a creed which became a rallying point for the Lutheran party, now for the first time called Protestant. Every effort was made to find terms of agreement between the rival parties in this assembly, and at one time Charles hoped this had been effected. But the Protestants would yield nothing from their side, and after much discussion they were outvoted, and the Diet passed a decree severely condemning their opinions. As a consequence, the Protestant princes of Germany, secretly assisted by both Francis and Henry in order to embarrass the emperor, formed for their mutual defence the League of Smakalden. But the Turkish invasion of Hungary had now assumed formidable proportions, and to meet it Charles, after great efforts, managed at the Diet of Ratisbon in July 1532 to arrange a truce on the religious question, whereupon the Protestant princes agreed to march with him against the Turks. Accordingly, in August 1532, Charles led a large army against Suleiman, the Turkish Sultan, who, overawed by this great display of force, retreated precipitately without risking a battle, and evacuated Hungary and Croatia. Having thus rescued Hungary, the emperor returned thence, and passed through Italy on his way to Spain. He had no intention of going to Rome, and ordered Clement to meet him at Bologna, regardless of the rough and difficult journey in which this would involve the Pope, who dared not go by the main road which passed through Florence. They met at Bologna in December 1532, when a second conference between them took place. At this meeting Clement was made to feel more than ever the galling yoke of his bondage to Charles. The latter knew that during his absence in Hungary, Clement had been again making overtures to Francis, and intended to put a stop to all such procedure on his part. As a counterpoise, however, Clement had prepared a scheme for the emperor's discomfiture. While the compact which he had secretly formed with Francis, and which included specific proposals for an attack on Milan, did not prevent Clement's forming, at this meeting, an agreement with Charles to oppose Francis, should the latter again endeavour to take Milan. England. For nearly 6 years, Clement had, by various artifices, been keeping Henry VIII at bay over the question of the divorce which he desired from his queen, Catherine of Aragon, the sister of Charles's mother, Joanna. Clement, in his position with regard to Charles, desired to retain the valuable aid of Henry as long as possible. At the same time, if forced to choose between the two, it was Charles whom he least dared to offend. And as the latter's power over him grew every year stronger, it became more and more certain that Clement would soon be forced to make that choice, and to break with Henry, however much he desired to avoid it. At last, in 1532, Henry would wait no longer. He first tried to force Clement to his will by making the English Parliament pass an act abolishing the payment of first fruits to the Pope, power being left in the king's hand to suspend the act until it should be seen whether the Pope should meet his wishes. As this failed to produce the desired effect, Henry then endeavoured to force Clement to a decision between himself and Charles by forming an alliance with Francis against the emperor. Charles's retort was the meeting to which he summoned Clement at Bologna in December 1532. At which he showed the Pope, with great plainness, that he must not dare to offend him, and must throw over Henry and refuse to agree to the divorce. But the more Charles made Clement feel his bondage to him, the more disinclined was the latter to lose any friendship which might, sooner or later, prove a help to him to get free from this yoke. Therefore, in secret, he still did not despair of contriving by some means to avoid an absolute rupture with Henry. On the 25th January, 1533, Henry was secretly married to Anne Boleyn. In February, Clement, ignorant of this marriage, granted at Henry's request a bull, making Thomas Cranmer Archbishop of Canterbury. In May, the question of whether or not Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been illegal was tried in the Archbishop's court, and on the 23rd May both houses of convocation, several foreign universities, and many of the leading canonists of the day having given the opinion that that marriage was void from the first, the Archbishop, acting with other bishops, annulled it, and 3 days later confirmed that with Anne Boleyn. But even this did not cause Clement as yet to break with Henry. Francis was Henry's close ally, and Clement hoped to obtain Francis's influence with Henry to persuade him against a breach with the Pope. Therefore, though Clement expostulated and threatened, the final thunderbolt of an excommunication was held in abeyance for more than a year, Clement hoping by persuasion to induce Henry to take back his wife, when his fickle nature had had time to grow tired of Anne Boleyn. Although Clement had succeeded in his scheme as regards Florence, he did not find his own position improved. The emperor still held him bound in fetters which were stronger than ever since Francis had been shut out from interfering in the affairs of Italy. And while thus cut off from gaining assistance from Francis, Clement felt that he was now being forced by Charles to break with Henry also, when he would become more than ever the emperor's bondslave. Clement therefore now executed his great and final coup. During the latter end of 1532, he managed, secretly, to arrange a compact with Francis, which would bind the latter to him by an actual matrimonial alliance. This was nothing less than that the heiress of the Medici family, Catherine, now 14, should be married to Francis's second son, Henry, Duke of Orleans, now about 16. The bait by which Clement won over Francis to this proposal was not only the enormous dower which Catherine would bring with her, but also an agreement on Clement's part to assist the French king to retake Milan. Having secretly settled this with Francis, Clement proceeded in December 1532 to the meeting with Charles at Bologna, and there, in the course of their discussions, Clement mentioned to the emperor the idea of such a marriage, pretending to ask his advice about it, and carefully concealing the fact that he had had any communications, on that or any other subject, with Francis. Charles, knowing that Francis was again planning to get hold of Milan, and being particularly anxious to prevent a friendship between him and Clement which might assist that endeavour, and never believing for a moment that Francis would agree to such a mésalliance, advised Clement to make the proposal, thinking that it would bring upon him a rebuff from Francis, which would produce ill feeling between them. Whereupon, to Charles' astonishment and disgust, the thing was promptly carried out. The emperor having departed to Spain, Clement pushed on all the arrangements as fast as possible, and in October 1533 the marriage was performed by Clement himself, Francis also being present. As a part of the terms of this marriage, it was secretly agreed that on Francis gaining possession of Milan with the Pope's assistance, that duchy should be given to Henry, Catherine's husband, Clement hoping to gratify his ambition by seeing one of his family in power at Florence and the other at Milan. And Clement returned to Rome in December feeling much secret satisfaction, not only at having achieved so advantageous a marriage for his family, but also at having outwitted Charles, who had held him so long in chains, and who was left with no power of taking offence at this marriage, since he had been led by Clement into actually himself urging the latter to propose it. But Clement had not a long time in which to enjoy feelings of satisfaction. Before 5 months were over, there pressed upon him, from another direction, matters which made the last half-year of his life more disastrous than all that had preceded. For the cloud in the west now grew to greater dimensions than those of a mere personal quarrel with a king, and in the last 6 months of Clement's life, events supervened in England which, in their momentous importance to the papacy, threw all else into the background. For here was no case, as in Germany, of a certain number of individuals, however powerful, revolting from the Pope, but an entire national church was casting off his supremacy, and a whole nation, by its legislature, enacting laws prohibiting obedience to his authority, while a king, instead of restraining these actions, was instigating them. And this nation also was that which had hitherto furnished the largest supplies for the support of the papacy. If 1 or 2 more countries should act in the same manner, there would scarcely remain any papacy to fight for. In March 1534, both the Church and Parliament of England separately repudiated the supremacy of the Pope. The Convocation of the Church of England, repudiating that supremacy as opposed to the principles of the Catholic Church, and an innovation which had not existed for the first 6 centuries of the Church's life, and declaring that the Pope hath no greater jurisdiction in this kingdom of England than any other foreign bishop. And the Parliament of England passing an act which made appeals to the Pope high treason. Thus the repudiation by the Church of England of the papal supremacy took place before the actual rupture between Henry and the Pope. This latter followed 4 months later, when in July 1534 the Pope pronounced a sentence of excommunication against Henry, unless he would take back Catherine of Aragon and put away Anne Boleyn, Clement thus still leaving a loophole, in the hope that a rupture between himself and Henry might even yet, at the 11th hour, be avoided. Henry, however, refused to do this, whereupon the breach became complete. Thus had Henry's personal quarrel with the Pope led to greater consequences than even a king's excommunication, and had enabled the Church of England to cast off that papal supremacy which had been wrongly imposed upon her for 5 centuries. The sentence of excommunication against Henry VIII was the last public act of Clement VII's life. He died less than 2 months afterwards, on the 25th September 1534, at the age of 56. His life ended in the midst of the gloom caused by the darkest of all the storms that had come upon the papacy, and he died with his name execrated in every country, and unregretted by a single human being. It might have been thought that whatever the northern races might feel, at least in the capital city of that papacy, on behalf of which he had contended so strenuously, some reverence might have been felt for him. But it was not so. In a letter to the Duke of Norfolk 3 weeks after the Pope's death, a Roman Catholic correspondent, Gregory de Casale, writes thus: "The joy in Rome was great. The most bitter hatred was felt for the dead Pope by every human being, a hatred which, unappeased even by his death, showed itself by repeated nightly attacks upon his tomb. Once it was absolutely destroyed, and the corpse was found transfixed with a sword. And had it not been for respect to the Cardinal de Medici, Ippolito, the body would have been dragged through the city by a hook. At length an armed guard had to be set over the tomb, since it was every night broken and defiled with all sorts of filth." Thus ended Clement VII. By setting before himself ignoble aims, and pursuing them with complete unscrupulousness, he did the greatest harm to his own family, to Florence, to Italy, and to the papacy. He died leaving half Europe fallen away from the papacy, Rome a ruined city, the name of his family hated where once it had been honored, and Italy, from Milan to Naples, a field of slaughter bathed in blood and tears. At first sight, Clement VII's pontificate is an enigma. He, one of the cleverest members of an exceptionally able family, who had been the guiding genius of the papacy throughout Leo X's much praised reign, seems in his own pontificate to be perpetually engaged in the most unsuccessful schemes, and involved in the most grievous troubles, indignities, and losses, all without any apparent necessity, and with a result which has caused his pontificate to be considered the most disastrous on record. The key, however, to this enigma, and the clue to the whole history of these 11 eventful years, is to be found in the reports of the Venetian ambassador at Rome, Antonio Suriano. The latter, immediately after Clement's death, set himself to show to his own government that one single underlying motive was the cause of all Clement's actions, and the key to his otherwise inexplicable conduct, and that this all-dominating motive was the endeavor to avoid the assembly of a general council. Suriano writes 2 long reports to his government to prove this point, and draws out in detail the many things which Clement was willing to endure for the sake of this one object, while he states that Clement's dread of a general council amounted to nothing short of abject terror. In his first report, Suriano points out at great length the many occasions on which this exaggerated terror had impelled Clement to the most strange course of conduct, stating that This overwhelming dread of the General Council, and this alone, induced the Pope to smother his resentment against the Emperor for the many mortifications received from him, and specially for the never-to-be-forgotten outrage of the sack of Rome. All was, if not forgiven, endured in silence, so long as there was any hope that by keeping Charles in good humour the council might be staved off. And it was only when the Emperor definitively insisted on its assembly that Clement began again to lean towards Francis, in the hope that the latter would impede it. Soriano states that Clement would not even suffer the word to be mentioned in his presence, and gives in detail the many cogent reasons he had for dreading it. In his second report, the Venetian ambassador gives a masterly sketch of Clement's whole policy, and again points out that through all his manifold schemes there had been this one motive only. For this, says Soriano, took place the conference with the Emperor at Bologna, and the league between His Holiness, His Majesty the Emperor, and your Serene Highnesses. For this the cruel and shameful siege and conquest of Florence. For this the marriage between the Emperor's daughter, Margaret, and the infamous Alessandro. For this again the marriage between the Duchessina and the son of the King of France. Again, for the same reason, when the arrest in Hungary of the Cardinal Ippolito de Medici occasioned the Pope, on account of the indignity, such poignant grief that he wept over it, yet was it all passed over unnoticed. Nor could any circumstance avail to arouse Clement or cause him to quarrel with the Emperor, since His Holiness considered that the friendship of the Emperor secured him from the council so much dreaded by him. For this same cause, pursues the ambassador, although His Holiness had but little love for the Emperor, who ruled him and led him whithersoever he would, yet he was obliged against his will, by necessity, to consent to whatever the Emperor chose, without manifesting any resistance, and all this from fear of the council. Therefore, considering this his painful position, and the slavery, as it may be called, in which the Emperor held him, and still more the danger of the council, he began to show himself more accessible to the most Christian king, Francis I, and hence the marriage of the Duchessina was planned. His Holiness's idea was that by this alliance of his niece with the son of the King of France, he should lay the foundation of two pillars of support for his family and his own affairs, especially in the so much dreaded matter of the council, in the hope that by these means some settlement of the religious questions might be attained, and at least the dreaded council be avoided. And Soriano sums up by saying, "Your lordships then may be assured that Clement used all possible means to avoid a council, and the fear of it tormented the mind of His Holiness to such a degree that by reason of it he even lost the friendship of the Emperor and of others, and finally his own life." To which may be added the break with England, for Clement would never have allowed the breach with Henry to occur had it not been for the threat of the assembly of a general council, which Charles V intimated to him in the plainest terms should be the result of his agreeing to the divorce of his aunt. But there is something deeper to be seen here, though strangely enough it has passed without notice. If we look back through the long roll of the centuries, we shall see that all this means, in one word, retribution. And so we see Canossa at last avenged, and after 4 centuries and a half, instead of the scene enacted there, which burnt itself into the memory of Europe, we see the roles reversed, and behold a successor of the Emperor Henry IV making a successor of Pope Gregory VII his abject slave, who trembled before him, and placed the papal authority at his entire disposal, to be used only in accordance with his behests. End of section 40.
Section 41 of the Medici, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dean Mock. The Medici, Volume 1, by G.F. Young. Chapter 18. In following Clement VII's history to his death, we have had to neglect for a time the younger members of the family, who during the last few years of his life were beginning to play their parts in the drama of the Medici story. These present to us a group of 4, 2 young men and 2 girls, 3 of them belonging to the family, while the 4th entered it by marriage. These occupy a considerable portion of the stage during the years 1530 to 1537. The 2 young men destined to meet with early deaths. The 2 girls destined to have long lives and to fill important places in history. They are Ippolito, the son of Giuliano, Duke de Nemours; Alessandro, whose dubious parentage has been already noticed; Catherine, the only child of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino; and Margaret, a daughter of the Emperor Charles V, who at 15 became the wife of Alessandro. Ippolito, as the eldest of the group, must be considered first, while Catherine, being so important a personage, must be dealt with separately. Ippolito, the son of the justly esteemed Giuliano, Duke de Nemours, appeals to us both on account of his own attractive personality and the sadness of his history. Born in 1509, and only 7 years old when his father died, he was as a child taken charge of by his uncle, Pope Leo X, who was very fond of him and watched carefully over his education, delighting in the ability which from an early age he displayed. But Leo died when Ippolito was only 12 years old. We have seen how when he was 15, he was sent from Rome by Pope Clement VII to reside in Florence, made a member of the government, and looked upon by all as intended, when old enough, to succeed to the rule of Florence, which had been held by his father. During the next 3 years, he, with Alessandro and the child Catherine, remained at Florence under Cardinal Passerini's charge, living in the Medici palace, until, when Ippolito was 18, the 3rd banishment of the family took place. Ippolito thereupon became, for a time, a wanderer, but when Pope Clement got back to Rome at the end of 1528, Ippolito also returned there. Ippolito was, by this time, 20 years of age, handsome, courteous, good-natured, highly cultivated, possessed of much ability, and a universal favorite. Varchi says of him that he was gifted with every accomplishment, affable and pleasant in his manner, and most liberal to all who excelled in war or letters or in any of the liberal arts, while another quality which the contemporary writers constantly speak of as possessed by him is that of royal-mindedness. Towards the end of the year 1529, Clement VII began to form a plan of supplanting Ippolito as the future ruler of Florence by Alessandro. This was the more unpardonable in that Ippolito was eminently qualified for that position, while Alessandro, being uneducated, vicious, and universally detested, was as conspicuously unfit for it. Clement began privately to carry out this scheme when making a secret treaty with Charles V at Bologna in December 1529, the 3rd and 4th items of which treaty provided for this arrangement. These intentions were, however, kept concealed from all concerned, except the emperor, until Florence should first be subdued and Ippolito disposed of elsewhere. In the spring of 1531, after the siege of Florence had ended, but while the Pope's intentions had not yet been allowed to transpire, Ippolito, Alessandro, and Catherine were all once more together in Rome, Ippolito being then 22 and Catherine 12, and the idea of these 2 becoming united in marriage began by some to be entertained. But their common guardian, Pope Clement, had other plans for both of them. He intended to use Catherine as the bait by which to secure the alliance with the King of France, which he desired as a defense against the thraldom of the Emperor, while he had reasons for his own for intending that Alessandro, and not Ippolito, should be Duke of Florence. So, while during the early part of 1531 affairs in Florence were left to be carried on by the provisional government under Valori, Clement completed his arrangements for making it equally impossible for Ippolito to become Duke of Florence and to marry Catherine. Ippolito's natural bent was towards the profession of a soldier, and he disliked everything connected with the ecclesiastical life and the ways and modes of thought of the ecclesiastics, among whom the greater part of his boyhood and youth had been passed. Clement, however, who managed these young scions of the family like pawns on a chessboard, and had numberless ways of forcing them to conform to his will, now proceeded to carry out his object as regards Ippolito by conferring on him the dignity of a cardinal. Ippolito violently refused to accept the proposed honor, but eventually was forced to submit, though he never would wear the cardinal's dress when he could help it, and to get him out of the way was dispatched on a political mission to Hungary. This done, Clement sent Alessandro to Florence, where in July he was declared head of the Republic, and 10 months later, while Ippolito was still absent in Hungary, the Republic was abolished, and Alessandro declared Duke of Florence, May 1532. Alessandro. Installed as absolute ruler of Florence at the age of 20, Alessandro showed all the inherent evil of his nature. There is only one example in Florence of the plain ducal coronet. It is to be seen surmounting Alessandro's name over the door leading into the Ognissanti cloisters in the Via Borgo Ognissanti. And sore reason had Florence to look with hatred on that sign of her subjugation. There followed the 5 most shameful years of her history, the exaltation of this foul and evil youth to a position of power, absolutely uncontrolled, showed mankind an example of what human nature is capable of under such conditions. His sycophantic admirer, Ceccaregli, in his Azioni e Sentenze, credits him with wit and wisdom, a fine sense of justice, and judgments which would have done honor to a Solomon. But if this was the case, it was combined with other qualities which obliterated all such considerations. An historian of his own time calls him a creature who would have disgraced even the deadliest epochs of Roman villainy, while another describes him as one whose excesses were as controllable by human reason as those of a beast of the forest. None dare defend him or refuse him anything, lest he should murder those dearest to them. Trollope says, "The portraits of this wretched youth, which hang on the walls of the Florentine gallery, show the lowness of the type to which his organization belonged. The small, contracted features, the low forehead, and mean expression are altogether unlike any of the Medici race, in whom, whatever else they might be, there was always manifestation of intellectual power. His life was one continued orgy. The ministers to his lawless will were ruffians, chosen from among the vilest of mankind. And these men were made not only the ministers to, but the companions of his pleasures, and the companions also of the young, the wealthy, and the beautiful among the aristocracy of Florence. What wonder that disgust and indignation at being subjected to such a rule was the prevailing temper of Florence, or that after 3 years an appeal should have been made to the emperor to remove so infamous a vassal. The wonder rather is that any city should have endured such a monster so long, and should not have deprived him of life within the first year instead of the 6th. The experience was a more bitter one to Florence than it would have been to other cities. Others had had tyrannies to endure. Florence had never known the rule of a tyrant. The experience killed her very soul for a time. Margaret. In the spring of 1533, when Alessandro had been for about a year Duke of Florence, the 4th member of the group, Margaret, then a girl of 12, fair and pretty, and engaged to Alessandro in accordance with Clement's compact with the emperor, passed through Florence on her way to Naples. Born in Flanders in 1521, she had been brought up by her 2 aunts, Margaret of Austria and Maria of Hungary, and was now sent by her father, the emperor's orders, to reside at Naples until the time should come for her marriage to Alessandro. Catherine, 2 years older, who was then in Florence preparatory to her departure from Marseille for her own marriage, rode out to meet her at the Medici Via of Cafoggiolo, in the valley of the Mugello, on the road from Faenza. And thence, on the 16th April, 1533, these 2 girls, so different in appearance, and destined to have such very different histories, together rode to Florence. Margaret remained for a few days to be shown by Catherine the principal sights of the city, and then continued her journey. For the next 3 years, Margaret remained at Naples, and as Alessandro's enormities yearly grew more notorious, there began to be doubts, especially after the death of Pope Clement, whether her marriage would take place. So iniquitous did such a marriage seem, even in that age, that the Fioriusiti did not believe in the projected marriage, because they did not believe that the princess could be given to a man so infamous. However, Charles V evidently thought otherwise, and even Pope Clement's death did not cause him to alter his intention to carry out the marriage which had been settled upon between them. Ippolito. Although the way he had been treated caused a great change in Ippolito, a permanent sadness coming over a disposition which had before been full of brightness, we do not hear of his showing any resentment. He developed a great liking for the Hungarians and for Hungary, and while in that country was fond of wearing the Hungarian dress, though on one occasion while there he was made prisoner under a mistake, a matter over which Pope Clement suffered much humiliation. On his return from Hungary, Ippolito took up his abode at Bologna, and shortly afterwards complied with the Pope's request that he should accompany him to Marseille to be present at Catherine's marriage. At Bologna, Ippolito lived in great style, and an incident connected with his life there gives an example of his character. Clement VII, thinking the number of retainers maintained by Ippolito excessive, remonstrated with him, whereupon Ippolito replied, "No, I do not maintain them because I have need of their services, but because they have need of mine." Ippolito had all the family taste for learning. He wrote various poems, and translated the second book of the Aeneid into Italian blank verse, a work of which has been highly praised and often reprinted. In 1534, Pope Clement being ill, Ippolito returned to Rome, and was with the Pope when he died in September, on which occasion we hear of his protecting the latter's body from insult, while it was he who thereupon commenced the construction of the tombs in St. Maria, sopra Minerva, to the two Medici popes, Leo X and Clement VII. Perhaps we shall not be wrong in considering that Ippolito showed the nobility of his character in nothing more strongly than in never exhibiting any malice towards Pope Clement for the way in which the latter had cheated him and ruined his life. Yet he evidently felt it deeply, for Varchi tells us, when he understood that Pope Clement had decided that Alessandro was to be made the heir to the riches and greatness of the house of Medici, and not himself, a great change took place in him. He was seized with immense anger and grief, as it seemed to him that being older, a nearer relation to the Pope, and better endowed by nature, so rich an inheritance and so brilliant a marriage, should rather be his, either not knowing or refusing to believe the secret rumors that Alessandro was the son of Clement. It is peculiar to notice how it is assumed as a matter of course that nearness of relationship to the Pope, and not right of primogeniture, as a grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, is that which should constitute Ippolito's stronger claim. Contemporary historical events, 1534 through 1535. On Clement VII's death, Alessandro Farnese was, on the 11th October, 1534, elected Pope in a conclave which only lasted 1 hour. He took the name of Paul III, and within 3 days of his election, he ordered a committee to assemble to draw up a scheme for the reformation of the Church, and to consider the time, place, and mode for the assembly of a general council. In politics, also the new Pope adopted a totally different course from that of his predecessor, endeavoring to assuage the animosity between Charles and Francis, and maintaining a position of neutrality between them. The above course of action on the part of the Pope changed the entire political situation, while it enabled the Emperor to turn his attention to the affairs of Germany and to resisting the formidable encroachments of the Turks. In May 1535, Charles V sailed with a great fleet from Barcelona to attack the Barbary pirates, who under their commander, Shereddin Barbarossa, had established themselves in Algiers and Tunis, and ravaged the coasts of Spain and Italy. The pirates were defeated, and Charles took their capital, Tunis, and in August returned in triumph to Sicily. Ippolito. In June 1535, Pope Clement being dead, and Alessandro having in the 3 years he had been in power so outraged the Florentines that he had driven a large number of them into voluntary exile, These Furiceti determined to send an embassy to the Emperor Charles V to appeal to him against the atrocities of his vassal and to petition for his removal. The Furiceti had always been a recognized party in Florentine politics, as whichever party was in power caused a number of the opposite party to quit Florence, either voluntarily for their own safety or by being exiled. But under Alessandro's evil tyranny, they had come to muster unusually strong. They selected Ippolito as their ambassador to lay their petition before the emperor, the latter being then at Tunis on his expedition against the Barbary pirates. Ippolito, who was then at Rome, started upon this journey and got as far as Itri, near Gaetia, between Rome and Naples. But while waiting there for a vessel in which to embark for Tunis, he was poisoned. And the proof was overwhelming that it was done by Alessandro. The agent employed was one Giovanni Andrea of Borgo San Sepolcro, and besides the universal opinion and the testimony of other historians, Varchi gives proof, which is practically conclusive, that he was employed to commit the crime by Alessandro. Thus died, at the age of 26, the accomplished and deservedly popular Ippolito, put out of life, like so many others, by the detestable youth whom Clement VII had placed in power in Florence. The assassin, Giovanni Andrea, did not long survive. After effecting his escape from Ippolito's servants, who in their rage would have torn him in pieces, he fled to Florence and lived for some months in Alessandro's palace, protected by the latter. Thence, after a time, he went to his own town of Borgo San Sepolcro, but there the people, in an outburst of popular indignation at his crime, in killing one so universally admired as Ippolito, seized him and stoned him to death. As we look at Titian's portrait of this handsome and accomplished grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent, we see his whole character and history laid bare before us. Though a cardinal, he will not be painted in that hated dress, but wears his favorite Hungarian costume, and the sword which he would have liked to bear as a soldier. His chivalrous spirit, high temper, quick intelligence, and that quality of royal-mindedness which those around saw in him, are well brought out by the painter. The picture was painted after that great change in him of which Varchi speaks, and his face may well have that look of permanent sadness, since, too wholly in the power of his crafty relative the Pope to resist after the thing was done, he had by various subterfuges had his whole life spoilt. Titian was at this time at the height of his fame, the greatest portrait painter in Europe, and much in request at all the most splendid courts. He had passed from the patronage of the Duke of Mantua to that of the Emperor Charles V, whose admiration for him was exemplified in his speech on picking up Titian's brush from the ground, declaring that a Titian might well be served by Caesar. In order to give a high relief to the head Titian was fond of using, as in this instance a black background in his portraits, Ruskin, speaking of them, says, both for what they present and the manner of their presentation, Titian's portraits are among the artistic marvels of the world. End of section 41. Section 42 of the Medici, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dean Mock. The Medici, Volume 1, by G.F. Young. Contemporary Historical Events, 1536. In January 1536, war again broke out between Charles and Francis, while the latter brought another powerful adversary into their conflict by concluding an alliance with the Turkish Sultan Suleiman. The French overran the whole of Savoy and took Turin. Charles, then resting in Naples after his North African expedition, remained there from December 1535 to March 1536. He then traveled northwards to oppose the French, and in passing through Rome, made arrangements with Paul III for the assembly of a council of the Church as soon as a state of peace should be obtained, though it was 9 years before the council was able to assemble. Having arrived in northern Italy, Charles repulsed the French and then invaded Provence, but in September was forced to retire again to Italy, Savoy remaining the prize of France, and the territories of its duke becoming reduced to the single town of Nice. Alessandro. Whether or not Alessandro's enormities had become so pronounced before Pope Clement's death in 1534, they evidently had fully done so by June 1535, when Ippolito's mission took place. It therefore immeasurably lowers our esteem of the Emperor Charles V, who must have been fully aware both of the abominable state of things which had caused Ippolito to be sent, and of the circumstances of his death, to find that in April 1536, on his way northwards from Rome, he stayed in Florence at the Medici palace with Alessandro, and on the 19th June, in the same year Alessandro was married in San Lorenzo to the emperor's daughter Margaret, then 15, the last iniquitous step in the compact made by Clement VII with Charles V at Bologna in 1530. But all was of no avail. 6 months later, on the night of the 5th January, 1537, came the end of Alessandro's vicious life, at the age of 26, and in the way in which it was bound to come sooner or later. He was assassinated by his young relative and boon companion, Lorenzino, of the younger branch of the Medici family, then aged 22, assisted by a hired assassin, Scoronconzolo, in a room in Lorenzino's house adjoining the Medici palace, to which house Alessandro had gone late at night, imagining that he would meet there a lady of whom he was enamored, and who was none other than Lorenzino's own sister, Laudomia, the young widow of Alamanno Salviati, who, we are told, was as virtuous as she was beautiful, and who had previously rejected the Duke's odious attentions with scorn. Lorenzino, however, was merely deluding him, and instead of his sister, brought in the assassin, Scoronconzolo, and together they put an end to the detestable being who had for 5 years outraged Florence. Lorenzino was a strange youth. He was the eldest of the 4 children of Pier Francesco, the younger, and Maria Soderini, and had decided ability and character, while it is specially recorded of him that he had much culture and literary talent. But he is said to have acted at times as though seized with temporary madness. On one occasion, when in Rome, he, although a great admirer of antiquities, in a sudden freak knocked off the heads of several fine statues of the Emperor Hadrian, at which act Pope Clement was furious, threatened to hang him, and banished him from Rome. He was 17 when Alessandro was made Duke of Florence, and from that time he became the latter's constant associate and companion in all his vicious courses. His devoted mother, the widowed Maria Soderini, did her utmost to lead her eldest son into better ways, and to get him to break off his connection with Alessandro, but unsuccessfully, a failure accounted for by Lorenzino in his defense by his statement that his conduct had had a deliberate object. His sister, Laudomia, was a celebrated beauty of the time. Her portrait, painted by Bronzino, is to be seen in the Accademia delle Belle Arti, Florence. Leaving Alessandro's body where it lay, Lorenzino forthwith took horse and fled from Florence, riding hard through the night for Bologna. Next morning, the Duke's servants, finding him absent, suspected foul play. Search was secretly made for him, and at evening they discovered his body, lying in the room in Lorenzino's house. His death was kept secret, and the body hurriedly conveyed by night into the little church of San Giovanni, close to the Medici palace. There it was prepared for burial, and on the following night was carried by a few servants, with great secrecy, to the church of San Lorenzo, and without any religious service was hurriedly placed in the sarcophagus containing the remains of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, neither wife, relative, nor friend of any sort being present at this dishonored interment. After halting a few hours in Bologna, Lorenzino fled on to Venice, where was then living Filippo Strozzi, who was at this time the leading man among the Fuorositi. When on reaching Venice, Lorenzino burst into Strozzi's room, and related what he had done. Strozzi embraced him, calling him the deliverer of his country, and the Florentine Brutus. Strozzi's delight was so great that he declared that his 2 sons should marry Lorenzino's 2 sisters, which was in a short time carried out. Piero Strozzi marrying Laudomia, and Roberto Strozzi marrying Maddalena. Lorenzino's act has been the subject of much controversy. By some, he has been considered the liberator of his country from an intolerable state of things for which there was no other remedy, since appeals to the emperor had proved useless. By others, he has been called a traitor and a regicide. Possibly, it would be necessary for us to have to live under such a tyranny as Alessandro's before we could form a just opinion on the point. Be that as it may, praises were lavished upon Lorenzino from every side, and both the Florentines in exile throughout Italy and those within the city compared him to all the heroes of patriotism in history. There are only 3 possible motives for his act: personal ambition, the liberation of his country, and the protection of his family from insult. None have considered that he was moved by the first of these motives. He was, it is true, the rightful heir to the position in which Clement VII had placed Alessandro, but he never seemed to care for such a position, and was entirely without any family influence to enable him to profit by Alessandro's death, almost his only male relative being an unknown and equally powerless youth of 17. In the detailed defense of his act, which he drew up, he stated that his whole course of action had been a deliberate plan in order to free his country from a monstrous tyranny which had become insupportable, and this account of the matter is believed by historians to be the true one, even though it involves the possession by Lorenzino of an amount of determination beyond his years. But while the above motive on public grounds was that put forward by Lorenzino, he had a no less powerful private one, even though he, naturally enough, did not wish to state it, for in the circumstances under which Florence was at that time, this youth of 22 had certainly no other way by which he could protect the honor of his sister. As a mark of ignominy, Cosimo I, on succeeding to the rule of Florence, caused Lorenzino's house to be entirely destroyed. It has in recent times often been declared that Cosimo, on pulling down the house, opened in the place where it had stood a narrow street or alley connecting the Via Larga, now Via Cavour, with the Via Ginori, and called it the Strada del Traditori. But this is disproved by the very rare work in the State Archives, the Ricerche alle Casi di Frenzi, anno 1561, a record very carefully compiled of every house in Florence at that date, carried out block by block from corner to corner of the 4 streets enclosing each block. This shows with great exactness, first, that there was no street or alley near the Medici palace running from the Via Larga to the Via Ginori, and second, that in 1561 the house of Lorenzino had been not merely spoilt, but entirely destroyed. This record, in regard to the Quartiere San Giovanni, starting from the corner at the intersection at the Via de' Gori with the Via Larga, mentions first the house of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the Medici palace, and then says that the next house is a ruin, that which formerly belonged to Lorenzino de' Medici, already entirely destroyed, rovinato, while it mentions no street or alley running from the Via Larga to the Via Ginori. This proves that there was then, at all events, no Strada del Traditori, while it also disposes of another theory which has been held, viz. That Lorenzino's house was that which is now number 5, Via Cavour. The former site of Lorenzino's house is, in fact, covered by the northern portion of the Medici palace, which was added by the Riccardi family when they bought the palace in 1659, part of which addition has an empty space left on the first floor, in accordance with one of the conditions of the sale, which in giving permission to the Riccardi family to build the proposed extension of the palace, on the site laid down the condition that such a space should be left above the ground floor at this spot, as a memorial of the murder of Alessandro, which had taken place in a room similarly situated. Until the year 1875, though it was always known that Alessandro's body had been interred in the tomb of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, it was a debated question which of the 2 tombs in the new sacristy was that of Lorenzo, and which that of his uncle, Giuliano. In that year, however, the Italian government authorized an investigation to settle the point, and the sarcophagus over which sits the figure called Il Pensieroso was opened in the presence of a representative of the government and various literary men interested. It proved to contain, says the account, 2 corpses which turned to dust as soon as the air was admitted, but not before the figure of Alessandro had been perfectly recognized, both by its mulatto type and by the marks of the wounds, especially those in the face, which he had received from Lorenzino and the hired assassin, Scoranconsolo. Another account denies the turning into dust, and says that there were signs of embalmment, that the 2 bodies were lying head to foot, and that Lorenzo's was clothed in the usual black garment, but Alessandro's in an embroidered shirt. Mr. Charles Heath Wilson, who was present, remarked that one of the cheekbones of the latter body bore traces of a stab, and that this corroborated Varchi's account of the murder. Margaret. When the tragedy of Alessandro's murder occurred, Margaret, not knowing what might be the consequences to herself of the removal of a husband so justly detested by every soul in Florence, fled at once to the Fortezza, which was held by the troops of her father, the emperor. Thence she departed first to Prato, and then to Pisa, and after a short time, by the emperor's orders, removed to Spain. There, 8 years later, she was at the age of 24, forced to marry a boy of 13, Ottavio Farnese, grandson of Pope Paul III, and became, in afterlife, a very capable and celebrated woman, who as Margaret of Parma was in 1559 made regent of the Netherlands by her half-brother, Philip II, and ruled that country well under the most difficult circumstances for 8 years. In 1567, she insisted on resigning that rule because she would not be a party to the inhuman measures which Philip had sent the Duke of Alva to the Netherlands to carry out, her last act being to write Philip begging him to temper justice with mercy. Amidst general expressions of regret, she retired from the Netherlands to her home in Parma, where she died in 1586. Margaret was the last mistress of the family palace in the Via Larga. Contessina de Bardi, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, Clarice Orsini, Alfonsina Orsini, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, and Margaret herself had each in turn ruled as its mistress, and when the last of them fled from it in terror, the palace where so many momentous events in the history of Florence had taken place ceased to be occupied by the head of the family, giving place to a palace, grander indeed in size, but unable to compete with its predecessor in the magnitude of the associations which the latter gathers round it. On Alessandro's death, Clement VII's scheme for keeping the rule of Florence in the elder branch came abruptly to an end, since all of that branch, except Catherine, were dead, and the succession passed to the younger branch, as it should properly have done on the death of Leo X. All the falseness, injustice, baseness, and treachery employed in order to seat Alessandro on a throne to which he had no right had produced nothing whatever so far as keeping the younger branch out of power in Florence was concerned. Entirely defeating its own aim, Clement's action had only rendered it more easy for them both to gain that power and to make it a despotism. But before we proceed to take up the history of this younger branch, we have still to follow that of the third member of this group of 4 young people, the daughter of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, and great-granddaughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent, with whom Cosimo's branch ended, and who had the longest and most important history of any of the family. End of section 42. End of the Medici, Volume 1, by G.F. Young.